The program today is very special. Today we're going to actually rehearse the full set of themes that we wanted addressed in the conference. The theme of the idea of an imminent disaster and the possibility of an ecological approach. We're going to be looking at the pure poetry of construction. Chris Williams will be taking over after Sylvia Karras. And Sylvia Karras will be talking to us, I hope, about her wonderful project, which will look at the tectonic on the larger scale that we've decided to address today. Then after that, we're going to have lunch, and two wonderful architects will be taking over from there, and we'll be closing the conference with a talk by Petra Blaise, the interior architect for OMA Architects. And then the closing words will be given by John Habrake. So, the first speaker for today, Sylvia, could I ask you to come to the podium, please?
Kan ik de lijstjes doorklikken?
Wat zeg je? Ja, dat moet zo met die computer helaas. Ja.
Everybody? Does it work? Yeah. I have the honorable job to get everybody awake this morning after the party from tonight. I would like to tell you something about our project, about Tectonics. Is it okay? Not too close. I would like to tell you something about our projects and the way we go from the first beginning, from the conceptual idea until realization. And I focused about the aspect of tectonics. But first I would like to tell you a little bit about our office. We are 20 people in Hilversum in the Netherlands. And we have quite a large scope of projects. We are landscape architects, but we are working on the edge of landscape architecture, and urban planning. And sometimes we pass those borders. This is a project we did in London, for example, a feasibility study for the Cross River Park, a very large project in the urban situation of London. This is Bosrijk here in Eindhoven, part of the Phoenix location, and it's a very special area with lots of trees where we made the urban plan and now supervising the architects. Same the university campus in Amsterdam, where we made the urban plan together with KCAP, and now also supervising the architects, but also making the plans for the public space. A plan in Oslo for the harbor area, urban plan, but also small villages in Holland, like Blaricum, very small-scaled urban plan. Transformation of existing areas. And then we are working on different scales. This is a new park in Tilburg. It was supposed to be one of the main roads on the north side, but the road never came, and now it's going to be a park, and it's connecting the two neighborhoods, and we are now building this park. And a more recreational situation plan in Lithuania. Very special, very strange situation, but very nice to work on. Cemeteries, and also in our project we work a lot together with architects and urban planners. This is a plan that we made together with Onyx, architect from Groningen. So it is quite a wide scope of projects, and I think what makes it different, landscape architecture from architecture, is the fact that we are handling with living material. So I think it's quite different how you go handle this aspect of this living material, but also in the process. I think a building, you make the sketch design and the preliminary design, and then you build it, and then it's there, and it's very solid and present, and it represents also money. Landscape architecture is more about space. and space always costs money. And how you are dealing with this in the process and in time is very difficult, more difficult, I think, than architecture. And it makes also that you have a different approach towards the use of materials and towards your design. I think your design should be very strong in the future, how it will, how it is able to, how do I say that? The changes that will come there, and people will use it, and how your design is strong enough to survive the changes, but also to incorporate the changes. And that's why we always show this picture, which we think is very nice. It's somewhere in Brazil, and it is a situation where it was designed not for pedestrians, but the pedestrians took over the situation and they have their own way. And we like that very much. In our plans, we always try to have room for transformations, etc. I would like you to tell some of our projects. And the first one is a park we made in IJsselstein in the middle of Holland. It is, in fact, it is a gap between an old road with farmhouses and a new housing area. And sometimes it's only 10 meters and sometimes it's 120 meters. And it's 2 kilometers long. And what we tried to make is a connection with the present landscape. The present landscape is orchards, fruit trees. But also a kind of wet situation, which we call hakhout. I don't know how to translate it, but they cut the branches every 7 years. And it's a very green area. It's connecting to the green heart of Holland. And the city itself is very cute, in fact. There's mills and towers and everything. What we did is a connection between the old landscape that was there and the atmosphere of the landscape and the new influence of the new inhabitants in 2 layers, in fact. What we did is we accepted the landscape and the original lines of the landscape and the atmosphere of the landscape, which is quite basic, in fact. And we connected it with a very long path. It's 2 kilometers long, and it goes from the center of the city towards the green heart, the bigger landscape. So this path is connecting everything, and it's always connected to the new neighborhood, of course. But what was quite important in our idea is facing always the towers, and there's also this big broadcasting tower, you know it, in Lopik, but also a lot of other towers and windmills, and we were always try to look at the bigger towers, and that they the path was always connected to the sides. So in fact there are 2 layers of the original landscape and the new path. The new path is changing all the time. In fact, we made one detail, and sometimes it's a path, sometimes it's a bridge, and sometimes it is a quay. And so it's transforming all the time. And you see we made much more water. Water was quite important. We had to make lots of water. And this landscape is very basic and rough and down to earth. And then with the fruit trees, we try to connect as much as possible with the new neighborhoods. And here you see the path. Sometimes it's very down to earth and normal concrete path with steel sides. And sometimes it becomes kind of a bridge. And what we like very much is this contrast. So we often in our plans we look for the contrast. And in this plan a lot of things changed, which we did not include in our plans before. But it doesn't matter, because I think this contrast is quite strong and this path is very strong, and it doesn't really matter what happens in the surroundings, if things change or not. I think the strong element of the bridge and the path gives a very strong bone, in fact, the backbone to the whole park. Another plan which I would like to show you is a cemetery in Amsterdam. It's the New Easter Cemetery in the east part of Amsterdam, in Watergraafsmeer. It's a very old cemetery. It's from around 1900. The famous landscape architect Springer designed this first phase. And he extended the first part, and there was another extension later done by the city. So the lower part you see the oldest part of Springer, and then in the middle you see the extension of Springer, and the northern part is the new extension done by the city. We were asked to make a plan for the middle part in the north. It was a competition, and we were asked to make an area for ash urns, to put ash urns in. It's quite large, it's about 33 hectares, this whole cemetery. And for us it was quite important to have an idea about the whole cemetery. We could not make only this little point, this little area, without thinking of the whole. And what we said, it's important that we will restore the old part of Springer. And we can reinterpret the first extension, and we would like to develop the second extension, because there is not really very much quality in this zone. And what we said also is that we would like to connect this area with present society. Like Springer, more than 100 years ago, he designed a cemetery which was quite hierarchic. The rich people were along the big paths, the wide paths, and the poor people were in big fields all together. And nowadays, society is quite different. We have a very multicultural society in Amsterdam. And so there is much more variation, in fact, in all the inhabitants. But the people are more equal nowadays. So we would like to make a design that has that idea. So a lot of colors, very colorful, very much variety. But everybody, in fact, is as important as other people. So we came up with this first idea, which we translated in a kind of design, an idea for the whole zone, this whole zone. And in fact, we only had to do the middle part. So on this vision, we made the real design that we were asked for, in fact. We made this design, and you can see here very clearly the new intervention by the straight lines which we did, and the old parts. So the right and the left side are the old parts. And by making the very rigid system of the straight lines, the old parts became even much more important, we think. And the curved lines together with the straight lines were much stronger together. A very important thing is the pond, the blue line that you see. It's the only part where we could use the whole depth of this zone, in fact. It's 120 meters long. And it was very important to have one area where we really could make some space and really make a view and open it. And all the other lines that you see are different possibilities to bury your ash or the urns, or to put urns even. And the grey one that you see, that's a columbarium that we thought could be quite interesting. So here you see the very beginning of the cemetery. Plants are very young and start to grow. And this is how it looks in spring. So we have to deal with also, not everything is the same all the time. It's living, and also within the year, things are changing. It's not always the same. And sometimes the plants really grow high and higher than you expected, because the soil is very well here. And then, oh my God, we made a mistake. We had the wrong plants, and sometimes we have to change things again. And so it is, for us, it's very important that we are able to guide the process. And in Holland nowadays, that's really very difficult, because people are mostly interested in short interventions, and you make a plan, okay, very nice and sexy, and then, okay, we go to the next. And it's very hard to really, like this old man, we always use this picture of the old man, really to guide plans all over the years. And I really hope that we get more opportunity to guide this. In this situation, in the cemetery, we work now for many years, and we are really able to guide the process, and I think that's quite important in our profession. This part is a very intimate space in between hedges. And here we used, for the path, we used old gravestones, gravestones. And normally they crashed everything and used it as the basis for new paths. And we thought it was very, very sad to use those. So we turned them upside down and we used them for new paths. And I think that's quite beautiful to reuse, in fact, this material. It's beautiful material which has different colors, different textures, and it reflects very nice the light, as you see. We also used this in an older part on the cemetery. So this was a very old part which we thought could use some extra attention. So we planted the lavender and we made this new path beside it. So this is a connection between the new and the old, in fact, in a way that we think it could be interesting. So it makes the older part more interesting, and it gives a new focus on this area. This whole situation, the columbarium was quite important in this situation. And when we started it, we really didn't know what kind of material we should make it of. And we have been thinking of many options. It could be hedges, it could be wood, it could be stone, it could be concrete. And for us it was very important that it is sustainable and that it gets older in a nice way and that we could afford it. So we have developed many ideas, and for us it was really a searching, to search for the right scale, because it is something we don't know. In fact, this is a building. It is, the first part now is 19 meters long, and it is about 4 meters high, and it is 6 meters wide. So is it a building? Is it landscape architecture? What is it? We think it's more like a building, but it's a very strange scale. So we really had to study it. We made lots of models to look how it would see in perspective and how you would experience the inner parts. And we did lots of investigation to look at the scale of people. And so at the end, we ended up with this. So we thought it was important that you can see it as a whole. So it is these strong lines. The whole zone that it holds together. And then the passes are connecting. So the red things you see, they connect. But they have also interior spaces which are quite intimate. So it is a combination of the bigger scale, in fact, and very small scaled, intimate spaces where people can be with their family and remember their loved people, and very intimate situations. Well, as I said, it was very difficult to get the right scale. So we tried a lot of things, and at the end, I think we succeeded. But what was also difficult, this search for the right material. And we ended up with zinc on the outside and another material on the inside. The inside is concrete, white, very bright material, and the outside is zinc. And we choose zinc because we think it gets nice when it gets older. But we thought that it is nice combination with all the vegetation that we made. Different types of vegetation. This is one part with magnolia trees and ferns and grass. And this is in autumn when the colors are changing. It is always quite nice combination, but we also think it's nice in combination with the Dutch sky. The Dutch sky is quite gray many times. And it is this urn wall, this columbarium, is a connection, in fact, between the sky and the ground and the vegetation. But it was quite difficult because we are landscape architects. We are not architects. We don't have much experience in making buildings of zinc. So what we always do is that we make trials, mock-up as we call them. So we put all the difficult details that there are in this zinc, put them all together in these strange objects, and we made it on the site and tried all the difficult details, really tried them and learned from that. And that's what we always do if we have bigger projects, always try it and see it and feel it and see how it works and learn from that. So it really worked out very well at the end. It costs a bit of money, but at the end you can see this is how it looks now. And we think it is quite sharp. So for the first building in zinc, we were quite satisfied. But it was also the client that gave the opportunity to make this trial first and spend money on that. Here you see it from the inside. And so you see that it reflects the light from the inside and gives more other atmosphere on the inside. So this is really something you see often you see the pictures at the end and you don't know how the process is, but it's really a long process. And it's also a process that you really have to hold on and grip it into your hands and don't let go. And we have such a person, he studied here in Eindhoven at industrial design, and he is really very good at it. He never gives up until the end. And he makes the trials with the concrete and the steel and everything and talk with people how he can do that. So this is how it looks now at the end. And it is the same with the pond. The pond is a very important object. And it's a strange scale again. So the whole situation became empty. Some trees we kept. And then we started to make the bridges. The bridges are made of prefabricated concrete. And again, we did a lot of investigations to the material, but also to the colors. Colors are quite difficult outside. It's changing all the time with the light and with the season as well. So we came up with a very strange kind of color, which you normally never should choose. But in combination with the paving and the other elements, we think it's quite nice. It is a bridge that the water gets through. So it's in fact an object and the water gets through it, as you see here. So they're in the small lines, the water gets through it. And even the sides of this pond, it's stainless steel. And the new graves that are beside it, it is natural stone, basalt we used here. So the combination of these colors gives a very quiet atmosphere, which we thought was quite important to give more attention to the cemetery itself and to all the vegetation and the nice trees that were already there. Another part of this project is the cellar graves. That is, in fact, it's a new development in Holland, and it means that those are the cheapest graves that are on a cemetery, and people are buried in 5 layers and very close to each other. And normally, in 10 years, they will dig up all the bones again and get new bodies into it. So normally, those areas were quite messy. The vegetation didn't grow very old because they had to change it all the time. And with these cellars, the surroundings can stay and the trees can stay and everything. So they only have to clean the cellars and make them empty again. And we thought it is a bit weird to be buried in this situation, but it is quite normal in Holland. And people that cannot afford expensive graves, they can be buried in this situation, but we thought we have to do something. And we were asked to design the tops of those cellars. And in fact, there should be place for 5 people to be remembered. There should be place for 5 stones on the tops. But we thought it was also important to make something that looks very nice and looks very nice also in the future. And it looks rich as well, because they're the poorest people, and very often 50% even don't get a stone because they have no family or no money, or people don't care about them. So that's a bit sad. So we thought it should look quite good, and we developed this top, in fact. And what we would like, that if 50% of the people get a stone, you get an idea like this, a very scattered pattern with private stones and on the basis of the stones that is there for everybody. So we went to the factory and made special models for this, specially made for this. And in fact, this is the basis idea. And we spent a lot of time in investigation, the type of concrete, how it gets older, does it stay nice when it's raining, and things like that. And at the end now it looks like this. And I think it's quite nice, even if there are no stones at all, it looks good. And even if there is no planting or whatever, we think it is a nice pattern which gives identity to this whole situation. And this is another part, also with those cellars. And the vegetation can stay for a very long time, and the trees can grow very old. So in fact, we think by getting the opportunity by the client to do real investigation, we made something that can stay for a very long time. Another project in Melbourne, Australia. You might have heard of it. We did this competition. It was a competition which we did together with lab architects. They were at that time based in London. It was a competition for a complex. It's a bit like Centre Pompidou in Paris. It is a museum of modern art and Aboriginal art. It's a lot of restaurants and bars and cultural facilities. There is a multimedia center in it, and there is a very big square. So the project is called Federation Square, and Melbourne got this project because of the 100 years anniversary of the Federation of Australian States. And Sydney got the Olympics and Melbourne got this project. It is built on top of the railway tracks, as you can see. It is in front of the station, Flinders Station. It's a very nice site. It's connected to the center of the shopping area and the financial center, but it's also connected to a big park on the other side of the river. There's a lot of sport facilities around it, and the whole evening center, it is on the other side of the river, and there are lots of restaurants as well. So it is a very important place in the city. And we did this competition and won the competition, which we never expected, of course, being in Holland, in Hilversum, and winning this competition on the other side of the world. It was really a jump into the deep swimming pool for us. And it was very strange because it was very far away, but also the kind of this project you don't do so often. It's very special, and everything was special. So building, here you can see they are already building the walls in between the tracks before we finished the design. So we made the design for the competition and we won, and then we got the commission for it and to build it, and then the whole program shifted diagonal over the side, so everything had to be designed again. But in the same time, because of the time schedule, they had to build those walls already and the deck on top of the tracks, because otherwise it would not be ready in time. So we were designing and detailing at the same time, and that's very strange because you don't know what's going to be. And it was a very complex project. As you can see, I don't know if you can see the deck, the square is it has a height difference of 9 meters, and so on the right side you see the building, and there's this very big atrium in it. The atrium is a kind of in-between space between the buildings and the public space. It is public accessible at daytime. And the square is in fact connecting all the buildings. Here you can see part of the model. So you can see there is a height difference already of I think it's 3-4 meters. So there were bars underneath the square, and as you can see, this is the first trial with a lot of stairs and podiums and things like that. This is the square. It's quite large. I think it's almost 1 hectare, this whole public space. The whole site is 4.5 hectares. And this was really important connecting area with a lot of details and height difference which we had to solve. And it was underneath, it's quite special, they made a very special system for cooling down the air in the whole complex. It is based on the idea of a termite, I don't know if I have the right word, termietenheuvel. It's kind of a labyrinth of concrete, and it's cooling down. The warm air is put into it, and it cools down by passing this whole labyrinth. It's quite special, but it's underneath the square, so you don't see it, unfortunately. This square was quite difficult to detail and to think about what kind of material we should use. The idea was a kind of a landscape, maybe a connection to the red center of Australia, the desert area. And the topography is quite special, so it is really like a hill, made like a hill. And we used a lot of patterns on it to try to get the feeling of the scale again and what kind of material. And we were very clear that we should use a natural stone, but what kind of natural stone? And we started with granite, so we started to make patterns with 5, as you can see here, 5 colors of granite and mix them together. But we were not very satisfied by that, and it was still quite hard. So we kept on looking for other materials, and we visited lots of quarries in Australia to look for materials. But one, it was too small, and the other stone was too soft, and the other was not enough. And so every time there was something. And finally, at the end, one of the architects, Peter Davidson, he found a quarry on the other side of Australia, which was just enough. It had been closed already, but they reopened it, and it was just enough to use. And it's called Kimberley Sunset. It's a kind of sandstone, and it has an amazing range of colors. As you can see on the right side, on the top, it goes from very light yellow, which is almost white, until dark red, which is almost black. And in the stones itself, it has a very beautiful pattern. It's almost like paintings, so nice is it. And because of the system of this backpacking that they have in Australia, we could afford it because it's quite a distance. And they transported material to the other side, to the Kimberleys, and they, by backpacking, and they were quite happy to have something to bring back to Melbourne. So in that sense, we could afford it, this material. So that was one thing, we had the material, but then the pattern, how should we do that? And how could we make something that that's connected with the special slopes, and but also give some meaning to it, because it's in fact, this variation square has a certain meaning for the people in Melbourne. It is their square, it is the square at the moment in Melbourne. And the site itself hasn't been built because it's a kind of muddy area, so it has never been built with buildings. Later they made the train tracks on it because it doesn't matter that it moves a bit, but they never built on top of it. And now we were able to build on it because of new technologies. But still, it was an old area, and it has been used by Aboriginals before, and the Aboriginals had a special area a little bit beside it. They found marks from that period, and they found a drawing, and that's this drawing. They found it somewhere on the rocks, and we used this pattern to give a new meaning to this square. But how to do that? And we tried a lot of patterns on top of this square, and as you can see, we tried different patterns, and also you see the dotted lines. That is how the water could stream from it, because of course we had to make gutters and collect the rainwater. It was really a puzzle to get it done in a good way, and we made lots of trials on the site. On the left you can see we tried in different stairs, and we tried to make selections of the material itself. So we made 3 selections, more red and more yellow ones, and kind of in-between colors. Another thing was that we had to use this grey stone. The whole city of Melbourne, the inner city, they use this stone everywhere in the streets. And the parts that are connected to the city, we had to use this material. And we tried new ways how we could use this grey material. Here you can see again the tiles. And here you can also see in the tiles itself the pattern. It is really beautiful and very special. Here also we tried the lines and the directions, how we should make it. And what is quite special, that in the end, when it was realized, there was a family from Chile, and they worked more than a year in making this square, in paving it, and it was really a hell of a job. we thought it was also nice that we could make a connection to the art. Paul Carter, he wrote text which they used as pieces of art in the square. So we made those details. The texts were cut out of this Kimberley sunset stone and is connected to the squares on different locations, as you see. And this is how we solved the problem of the rainwater. We made a special system with very thin lines which the rainwater can go through it without disturbing the pattern and without disturbing the slopes that we were making. You can see the different planters. So we are landscape architects and we were supposed to do something with plants or trees or but of course it is an artificial situation. It's built on top of on a very artificial deck. But we made some big planters where we could plant big trees. And it's another very nice story. We choose very nice eucalyptus trees in a very early stadium, and it was really nice trees. And right before they should be planted, there was a very terrible storm in Melbourne. It was cold and windy and all the trees were broken. It was so sad. And then, well, we had to start all over again and we could not afford anymore the big trees. So now they're a bit smaller. But it shows again that our profession has to do with living material. And it's really, sometimes things are happening which you don't count on. This is how it looks now. You see the old part of the city connected to the new part, and although it is very expressive architecture, I think it's quite nice because of the scale and the colors of the whole complex. They fit very well together, I think, with the old city. And this is the square, how it's more or less now. And what I think is nice in this area is that it is a place where people can gather, and when there are important things like the new car of McLaren or the exhibitions or events, it's always on this square. And it's nice when there are only very few people. It is nice at night and it's nice in the daytime. What I think is nice is that it reflects the light. The building reflects the light in a very nice way, and you see also the building transforming in the evening. And it's good when there are only a few people when they are sitting there, and it can have 150,000 people. This was the demonstration against the war in Iraq some years ago, and there were 150,000 people on the square. Well, this is a project a bit closer in Amsterdam. It's the Arena Boulevard and the Amsterdamse Poort. It's the center of Amsterdam Southeast. Two areas, in fact. We were asked to make the design for this area. It is a strange area, especially this Arena Boulevard. It's the big stadium for football, for Ajax, and it has shops that have only a few front doors, and then there's a very closed atmosphere like this. People are only walking here with very big carton boxes with their new television in it. But at the same time, it's an area, the shopping area, but all the shopping is inside the buildings, it's not outside. But in the same time, it is an area where a lot of people that work on the in the offices around it and come at lunchtime. And when the weather is nice, they come there for lunch, etc. But it's always also an area, this is not right, I think, where thousands of football people come there and to watch football, and they really make a mess out of it. And it's an area where, on the other side, Amsterdamse Poort, where people just go for shopping, etc. So a lot of different images. What was quite important for us to make a connection between the two areas, and in fact the new railway station that just has been opened is this connecting point. But for us it was quite important also that the public space that is underneath this railway station connects the public spaces. And again, the same as in Melbourne in Federation Square is, it should be nice with only a few people, and it should also offer the possibility for the thousands of people going to this Ajax football stadium. So we made a design, and it was really a process to get into this design, especially because this Arena Boulevard is a very strange area. It is almost 1 kilometer long, and this is the lijnbaan of the, god weet je nou Utrecht, de Malibaan. Goed, de Malibaan compared to this Arena Boulevard. It's very long and very large, and at the same time we would like to make it more intimate. But at the same time we could not do that because of all the football supporters, and it was really a struggle to get this scale again. So we made a design which made it possible for big groups of people to go through it, and a lot of walking lines we took in account, and we made some elements that really influences the way people walk, and not stop them, but really steer them, in fact. There's a lot of topography again, so it's going up and down, and there are a lot of raised elements. The raised elements, it's more or less like a flipper cast, eh? So the ball is doing like this, and we would like to do that with all those thousands of people, but in the same time offer the opportunity for people to sit down and relax and be in the sun, etc. So this is some of the ideas we made by renderings. This is underneath the new railway station, so we made a lot of benches, edges in fact, where people could sit. But if there were no people, it's also nice. They don't necessarily have to be there. Like this, people could sit stand on it, etc. And again, this was this search for the material. What kind of material should we use, and what kind of pattern should we use? So we tried lots of try and error. It's always, designing is try and error, and learn from it. And we tried lots of different patterns. In this one we chose the long line, but we were not quite satisfied. And we chose the other, more the width, but it was also not very good. And we tried this one, or the opposite, or this one, and then we came up with more patterns like streams. And we ended up with this pattern. For us it was quite important to make a warm area, give a warm feeling because of the big space, which we could not make too intimate because of all the amounts of people that were there. But so the warm feeling, and also material that gets old very nice. Brick, we think it gets old very nice. But we could not use the normal Dutch bricks. The normal Dutch bricks are not very equal, and you can very easily take them out. So all the football people could take them out and throw with it. So we had to use these other bricks, which we call strengpersstenen, which are much straighter and less easy to take them out. And again, we started this search for materials and what kind of colors. We started to collect. I think we have seen all the fabrics factories that produce stones, and we know all of the people now. We started to collect colors and to see how we could mix them, because of course we don't have this very nice Kimberley sunset stone like we had in Federation Square. We have the bricks as they are, and they're quite the same color. There is not very much variation in the stone itself, so we had to make the variation ourselves by mixing different colors. And then we found out, so we tried a lot of mixtures, what kind of colors, and also the pattern, how we should make them, how we could make this, the shapes with it, and how it should be strong and things like that. We talked also to the factories, the people from the factories, because what we found out is that the different colors had different sizes, and when you start to mix them, they are not equal. And so what these guys did is that they were able, because it was such a big amount, of course, of bricks, they really they succeeded in making all the stones in the same size. And it's something you don't think about when you think, okay, I use the yellow and the red and the black one, and it doesn't matter. But they were not in the same size. And when you make such big surface, you really see the difference in the measurement. So we tried, we started to make examples on the factory itself, and we started to make mixtures of it. Later we did it on the site. We made trials on the site and learned from that. And then we found out about this measurement thing. And at the end, this is how it became. And of course, this is brand new, so it's still a bit colorful, but I think after some years it becomes a bit fake and a bit more gray, I think, by the dirt that it does collect, and then I think it's quite good. Of course, lighting is a very important aspect of this. We did the lighting in 2 layers, in fact. The one layer is this hanging system, in fact, like the sky with the stars hanging on top of the whole area. And the next layer is more down to earth, and it is light that is underneath the benches that we made and the edges. So we made lots of investigation and details how to make that, of course. But what we also did is that we studied the color of the light, because we wanted the color at night. Of course, there are a lot of people going out here at night, and we wanted these surfaces very warm and the colors in a good way. And that means that you have really to be careful what kind of light you are using. So we made, again, trials. Some lights are more yellow or more red or more white. And so that was quite nice. And we developed a special tube, in fact, for this underneath the benches. And well, this is just a few months ago. So we're starting to build it, and the first phase is almost ready now. And here you can see the scale of the area. It is seen from the railway station, and you see also how it works with the pattern and with the lines, etc. And here you see one of those benches. It's quite large, which we think is quite important, and people should really use it. And this is at the opening of the railway station. There were thousands of people and standing on it, and this is just the way that we like that it's used. People can stand on it, they can sit on it, they can use it as a podium when they make music or something, and it's not very defined what it is. It's not an empty bench. And this was at the end when, at the opening, our Princess Maxima came to see it and to open it, and that was really the first start of this project. This is also the end of my lecture. It's exactly 10 o'clock. So I hope that I gave you an idea of the type of work we are doing and the problems that we have to solve and the way we are dealing with this. And it's never a never-ending story. We're always looking for new materials, new ways of using materials. And again, I think I would like to get you as enthusiastic for that as we are in our office. And I know you in Eindhoven, there is a lot of attention for this subject. And I hope that there is also a little bit more understanding for the public space, because public space is not as easy. And there are so many people involved in this process of selecting materials and of maintenance. I did not talk about maintenance, but that's a very important issue as well. So I hope that you get as enthusiastic as we are about it. Thank you very much.
I noticed that in the Melbourne project there was one exciting moment that you, because you're very oriented towards material, and it seems to play an important part in your work. And in Melbourne, at a certain point, you inject meaning into the material by taking this Aboriginal pattern that was found on the site. Now, in the other projects, you seem to not to do that because you take a more abstract pattern or form that that you choose, and that's inspired on other reasons, or just not inspired. I don't know. So how obvious is this process in your design thinking, and how conscious are you with this giving meaning?
Well, it is different all the time, I think. It's not, we don't have a system for that. And sometimes, like in Melbourne, you're looking for something, and then you recognize this pattern and this drawing that they found, and you interpretate the drawing by something that people maybe would not notice when they come there, but when you hear the story, you know it, so it gives an extra layer, in fact. And well, like in the Arena Boulevard, we did not have this story, and it is a different. We were very busy with this whole practical thing, combining the two types of use of the one is very big scale with lots amount of people, and on the other hand, people that have lunch there and eat their sandwich on a bench or something. And for us, it was very important to give a pleasant atmosphere, the warmth of the area, and so we were very busy with that. So I think in the Arena Boulevard, it was, the meaning for us was not very literally a pattern or something, but it was more the atmosphere. Give people a more warm and rich atmosphere, which we think lacks until now in that area. And like in the New Easter Cemetery, there was this meaning of the idea of people being equal, but much more different. And give space to all the people that are there and in the very different cultures that they have. So it's different all the time, and we try to be aware of it. In one project it's much more present than in other projects, maybe.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Would anyone else like to? Ralph.
In this case of the Arena Boulevard, how do you instruct the workers actually?
The
workers, the stratenmaker.
It was funny. I had a drawing in it where it showed what would happen if a pipeline should be made in it, and how the workers should put the patterns in the wrong way back again. I didn't show it. But of course that's difficult, and we don't have a very good culture, I think, in Holland in realizing projects in public space. And we really have to fight for our influence in that phase of the realization. But what you see is that there gets 10 years ago it wouldn't have been possible to do this. Then it was really impossible. But I think by seeing other projects all over the world and talk about it, and that also politicians and people that work in the cities, they get more aware of that we should try other things than we are used to. The concrete tiles, 30 by 30 concrete tiles, there are more possibilities. And I think sometimes you have to take a risk for that. You cannot, if you solve all the practical problems, we don't get designs that we're quite happy with, I think. And of course, we cannot do that everywhere. But this is such a special place. In fact, it's the second center of Amsterdam. It will be in coming years. And then, you should pay some extra for that, and also try to get it in a good way. But it's a struggle. It's not easy.
There was another question here, I believe. Yes, Annabella.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on the question by him about meaning. Why is it that in Australia it is so easy to take a symbol which is present, which is belongs to the culture there, which was before white men, so to speak, and to use it, and it really has meaning, so to speak. And when you're working in Amsterdam, in, well, let's say the banality of Amsterdam Zuid, it is not the same process. I mean, this is an old culture too.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't you pick meaning from our own symbols in a way? That's the question.
well.
Yeah, you're right. We could have gave more attention to that. As I said, we were too busy with more practical things in this project, I think. But I think it's also a general question. I think, like in Australia, it's not that everywhere. This is one of the really top projects in Australia as well, and there was a lot of money for it and a lot of awareness in this process. Also, the artists that they hired were giving a lot of meaning to this whole project, I think, and there was a lot of attention for it and possibilities, and it's not so easy, I think, in other projects. You really have to fight for the space to give meaning.
Yeah. Don't you sometimes find that the symbolism gets in the way of things?
Yeah, sometimes it's too literally, I think.
Yeah.
I like it when you discover it in a kind of second awareness of the project. I think sometimes it's so literally, and then I don't like it. It's right. too obvious, I think. And what I like is that it's something you have to discover. Like in Australia, I think it's very good. So your first idea is, okay, this is a square and I can do this or that. And then when you go into it, you find those. It's like a treasure that you find. And I like the way that it's a kind of second experience.
Okay. Well, are there any other questions, or do you think we can close off this session? Sylvia, I'd like to thank you very, very much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Let me give you. Thank you. Was it a film or? Yeah. Please. So. Chris. All right, well, we go from the sheer joy of materials and materiality and the dynamics of materiality. The idea that things change, that things grow old, and that you have to think about that process of aging, that process of use and wear in your design. And I think that was a very, very provocative presentation, and I think it's quite a magic place, those two squares. Wonderful. So we now go from the joy of materials to the pure joy of construction. Chris, there's a very, very impressive bio blurb in our little booklet. I'm not going to repeat that. I think you should read that for yourself. But it reads like a who's who. And we're very, very pleased to have Chris Williams talking to us today about the joy of construction, I think.
Yes. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just waiting for the computer. Ah, here we are. Right, I thought I'd begin by showing you a computer program running. Oh, I don't know why that's appeared. Let's just see if it works. Oh, I'll try again. Right, that looks better. Now, there's a certain connection between this computer program, if it runs, there we are, and what Andrew Ballantyne was talking to you about last night with the linoleum. In the sense that what's happening here is that a process is occurring. I know what the rules are which control the process, but I don't know what's going to happen, in the sense that once you start the process then takes over. So in the case of the linoleum, as Andrew said, there was the physics of the process involving the steel rollers and the sawdust and so on. in this case, in this computer program, again, what's happening is controlled by the physics. But of course, in a computer program, you have the choice. You can either use real physics, try and model what happens in real life, or you can, if you want, imagine imaginary worlds where you invent the behavior. So in this case, the little dots move about under the action of forces, and if you modify the rules for those forces and you modify the way in which the dots react to those forces, you can get all sorts of different sorts of behavior. Every time you run the program, you get a different result, and sometimes it's not so interesting. Sometimes you get some quite complex, like this rather nice circular structure occurring, which then decays, and then if we wait long enough, we may find other interesting structures appearing. This actually happened by accident. I was trying to do something else, and so I wrote a piece of software, I then started to run it, and then found that this type of behavior was happening by accident. And I suppose in some ways the most interesting results always do happen by accident. I'll also try in my talk to talk a little bit about the practicalities of what I do, because I think, for me at least, the most important thing is not only to do things, but also to try and explain to people how things can be done, so that people can then learn to do it themselves. This program was written using a piece of software called Processing, which is a programming language which comes out of MIT. This program's running in real time on my computer at the moment. It works in both Macintosh, Windows, and also Linux, and you can download the software for nothing from the Processing website. And it's a very good website in the sense that there's lots and lots of examples there, very, very simple programs. And in a sense, what processing is about moving images, as opposed to creating static images, which is what programs like AutoCAD and MicroStation are about. So that was the first program. I'll now show you a second program. This is a well-known pattern that we'll get here. This is the Lorenz attractor. And in this case, again, what you achieve is a random pattern, but in this case, the pattern has a much more predictable structure to it. So this blue dot is moving about according to a rule. Its velocity depends upon its position, basically. So there's a relatively simple rule saying what the x, y, z components of velocity are in terms of the x, y, z coordinates. So it moves around, but this is a chaotic system. It's chaotic in the sense that it's impossible to predict in the long term where the dot will be. You can predict where it will go in the short term, but you can't predict where it will be after a few minutes, because even the slightest change in your initial position will have a very, very large change over your final position. This is written in C++. C++ and processing are very similar. They use a very similar syntax, in the sense that processing is essentially based on C++ or Java, which is then based on C++. C++ is more difficult than processing to learn, but it does run better. It runs faster. Now, the third program I'm going to show you is this one. And this one is different in the sense that, in this case, the program does exactly what you tell it to do. So in the previous two examples, I was looking for some sort of emergence, some sort of unexpected result. And of course, sometimes in architecture or in engineering, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for a process which will produce a result which is in some ways unexpected. But of course, a lot of the time, what you're interested in is a result where you have complete control and you know exactly what's going to happen. And that's what happens here. I move the blue dot around, and the curves move with the dots. The curves are based on the circles. So if I put the blue dot actually on a circle, oops, there we are, well, almost. If that blue dot was exactly on the circle, what I would get would be two circles exactly. I move the dot away from the circle, outside, and I get one curve right around the outside, one curve in the middle, and if I have the dot inside here, oh, I must have got the wrong version of the program. If I had the later version of the program, with the blue dot inside, I'd get two curves within the two circles. Now, I'm an engineer, but work very closely with architects. And what I'm particularly interested in is the details of shape and also of structure. Now, in this case, what I've done is to start with the equations describing the two circles, and then effectively to multiply those two equations together to produce this more complex shape. Of course, the alternative way of doing it would be to use something like Rhino or AutoCAD or MicroStation or whatever, in which case you would do this using spline curves. But in my view, spline curves are, well, they're okay, but they're not very pure. There's in a sense too much you can control with them, but also spline curves are not continuous. Spline curves are made up of little bits of curve which are joined together. Whereas what we've got here is just one curve going all the way around the outside and one curve in the middle, and that's completely continuous. So even when I put the dot like this, so that the inner part consists basically of two arcs, it's not two arcs joined by just a little bit of curve in between. It's actually one complete curve with no discontinuity between it. And of course, it's very difficult to know what the eye sees in terms of curves, what is satisfactory and what is not satisfactory. But in my view, at least, there should be a certain uniformity. Yes, I'll quit. Now, the reason I've put this slide up is because I think as an engineer or as an architect, and if you're interested in tectonics, what you're interested in is partly what you see and partly what is behind what you see. And I suppose the reason I've put this slide up is that we see three animals there. We see the killer whale or the orca on the top right, the great white shark on the bottom right, and a rabbit on the left. And I suppose, well, the question here is it's like a child's question, which is the odd one out? And I suppose when you immediately look at the pictures, you say, well, obviously the odd one out is the rabbit, because the other two things live in the sea. They're both very big and very fierce, and so on and so forth. They're both jumping out of the water, and so on. But then if you think about it a bit more, you begin to think, well, actually, the shark, I would say, is the odd one out. Certainly in evolutionary terms, the killer whale evolved, I think, from animals much more like rabbits, in the sense that the killer whale is a mammal. The killer whale is warm-blooded. The killer whale has live young. The killer whale feeds its babies with milk, and so on and so forth. And you could imagine perhaps having some sort of relationship with the rabbit. I think people have relationships with killer whales. So at a human level, the killer whale and the rabbit are much more similar. And I think it's the same thing when you come to the structure of buildings, the structure of bridges. It's the same thing when you come to the design process. It's the same thing when you come to computer programs, that it's not so much what you see on the surface, it's what's happening inside which matters. Now, sometimes when people start talking about computers and design and so on, they talk about it as if it's some sort of tremendously new phenomenon. Or obviously computers are relatively new, but the phenomenon of design is not new, obviously, and also in particular the phenomenon of the detailed aspects of design is not a new thing. I think there must always have been a collaboration between different types of people in building. There will obviously be the people who perhaps have the grand view, the flair perhaps. There are also people who have good relationships with the client, so they can play golf and so on and so forth. There are the people who actually do the work on site. And then in between, I guess, there must always have been people who do a tremendous amount of very, very detailed work involving deciding exactly how the construction should work. Now, the reason I've shown this slide is that I'm quite interested in this word appareilleur. Is that how you pronounce it? The French word. It talks there about the grand architect creates the sky and the earth with the aid of the big compass of the appareilleur. This is from a design from a Bible, a French Bible of the 8th century. So this person, the appareilleur, I think is the sort of thing that I do. I'm not sure. If there are any historians here, they might be able to help us more on what exactly that word means. I think to a certain extent the word appareilleur includes now what we might call structural engineers. And of course, in working in stone, you'd be very much interested in the geometry of the stone, how it all fits together, and also very much interested in the structural behavior or the structural action of the stone. So as a structural engineer, what I'm interested in is the relationship between geometry and structure. I think also, as an engineer, I'm very much interested in other sorts of engineering. This is Bertoni sculpting, it looks like a coupe version, but it's the traction avant, Citroën. This would have been in the 1930s, I guess, the early 1930s. So here, in automobile engineering, there was a combination of a sculptor, engineers, production people, and so on and so forth. Clearly, this car was designed without using computers. And I suppose one of the things that is most important to me is to say that even though I use computers and we use computers, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that they are just a tool. And people still use clay modeling in automobile design because there's something tactile and physical about the clay and about the physical model which you can never get from the computer model. Bertoni, I think, also designed the Citroën DS. This is actually an ID. This was designed in the early 50s, so that's 1950s, so that's 50 years ago, and again, obviously, without using computers. Today, of course, it would be unthinkable to design a car without using computers extensively for every part of the process. But in my view, you could argue that nothing really interesting has happened in car design since the 1950s. Certainly, between 1900 and 1950, the car evolved from almost nothing to this, and in the last half century, nothing comparable has occurred. And the same thing applies for aircraft. This is a Boeing 707, which came out in the 1950s, I think in about 1959. So again, this aircraft would have been designed without computers, or they may have been used very, very slightly, but hardly at all in its design. And I think in many ways, modern aircraft are very, very similar, but I think to a certain extent there's a sort of tightness to the design of this. A certain modern aircraft somehow seem more bloated. I don't know. There's a certain elegance to this design, which we maybe have lost. And this, I suppose, talking about aircraft, that then brings you to again back to the natural world, to birds. And the reason I've chosen this slide is because we can see in detail the wings of the albatross. In particular, we can see the feathers at the back of the wing. We can see the feathers at the tips of the wing. And as you know, modern aircraft have these little things at the tips of their wings which go up. And the idea of that is to reduce the drag that you get from the trailing vortices from the wings. And that's exactly why you have those long feathers on the wings of the albatross. So I think the relationship between nature and design. Sylvia talked about the termite's nest and the natural ventilation in Fed Square. Well, again, I think particularly in aerodynamics and structures, there's a lot to learn from nature, and it's a continual inspiration. And of course, one of the main people who have been inspired by natural forms is Fry Otto, there on the right. When I first started work for Ovarup, I joined Ted Happold's group. Ted Happold is the chap on the left. And Ted Happold worked with Fry for many, many years, with Fry Otto. We worked on a number of projects. The lower projects there are aviaries, and the inspiration there of the net comes from spiders' webs. So the idea was to try and understand how spiders' webs work, but not then to just copy spiders' webs, but to use those as an inspiration for the design. And I suppose as an engineer, working with an architect like Fry Otto was inspiring, because he just did think in very, very different ways. The upper building, the top building, is the workshop at Hook Park. Again, Fry Otto was involved. This is made from bending whole trees into shape. So here again, there's another connection with Andrew's lecture from last night, where he showed the curved ladder. The idea of using natural materials and trying to find an appropriate way of building with those natural materials. I have a friend, Richard Kreuker, in Canada, who has a very close relationship with some Native Americans. And of course, the idea of building from these sorts of materials is very much part of the Native American tradition as well. So Fry Otto, in his institute, would build all sorts of models with soap films, models with rubber membranes, hanging chains. That's the picture on the left, second from the bottom, is a hanging chain which has been inverted. And of course, in doing that, Fry Otto was following the example of Gaudi in his design of buildings like the Sagrada Familia. And this is a hanging chain model for a grid shell in Mannheim, in Germany. And this was the way that Fry Otto worked. He would build extremely accurate physical models and then measure those models with the most sophisticated electrical and optical equipment that he could find. Around this time, this was the mid-1970s, computers were becoming sufficiently powerful to be able to replicate this process numerically. And Klaus Linkwitz, who worked on the project, produced a numerical model of this hanging chain. But I was working for Ted at Ovarup & Partners in London, and our job was to design the structure, and in particular to show that the structure was going to be safe. The German authorities were very, or quite understandably, uncertain as to whether it would be safe, because the building spans about 60 meters, and it's made from wood, from timber, which is only 5 centimeters square. So it's a very, very slender structure. It's still there in the park in Mannheim, and this is a load test for the project, where 30 tons of water was hung from the roof in those dustbins by wires. So it was quite a stressful day, but the roof survived. And I suppose this project, like a number of other projects that I've worked on, have always looked best during the construction phase, which is always unfortunate. It's nobody's fault that it looks best in the construction stage, but the reason it looks best in the construction phase here is because it's before the cladding goes on. And of course, when you put the cladding on, you lose the beauty of what's beneath. In particular, what you lose is the fact that you can see through the structure from the inside to the outside. And also, if you stand on the outside, you can see through the structure and you can see the structure behind. So you get a very clear sense of the form of the object. Whereas when it's clad with a sort of plastic, translucent plastic material. It becomes basically like a big blob, and it loses a tremendous amount. We had a coach trip from Arup in London down to Mannheim. We drove to Mannheim on Friday night, and then we drove on Saturday from Mannheim to Paris, where Arup were working on Centre Pompidou. And Centre Pompidou was being built at that time, and at that stage the steel frame was in place without the cladding. And without all the fire protection which covers the steel plane, the steel members. And Centre Pompidou looked absolutely fantastic at that stage, in the sense that it looked like the bones of a dinosaur that you see in the Natural History Museum, because it was sort of dark and black and sort of primeval, and but of course, as a building, it just wouldn't have functioned. You've got to have walls, you've got to have fire protection, and so on and so forth. But it's sad, but it's unavoidable. This is a more recent project with Bureau Happold. Ted Happold left Arup in the mid-70s and started Bureau Happold in Bath, now in London as well. The architects were Foster's, and the steel and glass contractors were Wagner Bureau from Austria. The contractors, Wagner Bureau, had a tremendous input into the design, in the sense that you can only really complete the design of any building or any object when you know who's going to make it, because different manufacturers have different machines, they have a different tradition, and so on and so forth. Wagner Bureau have a particular tradition of welding everything together, and so the roof, the steelwork of the roof is all welded together, prefabricated, and then brought to site and then welded together on site. Now, my main job working on this project was the definition of the geometry. And as such, I was working for Bureau Happold. So on this project, the geometry of the building was defined by the engineers. I think partly as a result of experience on this project, Foster's decided to start up their own in-house group under the leadership of Hugh Whitehead, with people like Francis Aish and Brady Peters and so on, to develop their own in-house expertise in the development of the geometry of complex projects. And I think at the moment we're at a very interesting stage, in the sense that a large number of architects are beginning to realize that they have to take control of the geometry of their buildings, but also engineers are very interested in geometry. Engineers are particularly interested in geometry because, in a sense, particularly for a project like this, geometry is structure and structure is geometry. But in fact, it's actually not that much of a problem because the people who actually do it don't really care whether they're engineers or architects. They just are interested in the process. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter whether you work for a firm of architects or a firm of engineers. I think what's happening is that, to a certain extent, who does what is becoming much more blurred in this area. Clearly, geometry is always crucial to building. And the more structural that geometry, the more it's of interest to engineers. The reason I've shown this slide is because what we were concerned with here was to develop smooth curves, to have a shape which is as smooth as possible. And we've achieved that, I think, quite well, except possibly in the corners. We had real problems with the corners. We suggested to Foster's that they allowed us to put cable ties inside the building because the existing fabric of the building can't resist any outwards force, any horizontal force. So all the forces from the roof, the horizontal forces, are coming down into the corners. So there's a tremendous concentration of thrust coming down into those corners. And that's the reason that you see that there's a fold as you approach the corner. It's also the reason for these trusses, which you can't see inside here, those trusses which carry tremendous forces. The forces are so large that they're not trusses made from tubes or even trusses made from solid members. They're trusses which are machined out of solid steel. Massive forces in there. And again here, when you look at the corner, you can see what's happening, that there's this member that comes down and thrusts right into the corner. And you can see that there is a bit of a kink there in the corner. Whereas everywhere else in the roof, you don't really notice the change in angle between adjacent members. All the members are straight, but in general you don't see the change in direction across from one member to the next. Now, in terms of the detailed technique for defining the shape, again, I felt that spline curves or spline surfaces were not an appropriate way to define the shape. Partly because the splines means that your surface is divided up into essentially discontinuous patches. They're reasonably continuous in the sense, obviously, the patches meet each other. There's continuity of slope. You may have continuity of curvature between patches, but you won't have continuity of rate of change of curvature and higher derivatives. So there is something they're not quite meeting. And also, of course, you have too much choice if you use splines, but also not enough choice. Because what's happening here is that, in general, you want the surface to be very, very simple, but you also want to be able to control very, very accurately what's happening in the corners. And if you compare the middle picture and the bottom picture, the middle picture has got the surface coming down horizontally into the corners. And that's the only way the surface can come onto a corner without having infinite curvature at the corner. So the bottom one, as you come down to the corner, there's an infinite curvature in the theoretical surface. It's like coming down to the point of a pencil. It's like a cone. So what's happening in the corner there is a combination between the middle one and the bottom one. And it was juggling that combination between the two which created that corner condition. So a detailed analysis, or having to have detailed control over what was happening there, required this approach. There's the formula which describes the surface. And increasingly, I think, architects are beginning to get involved in things like this. And it doesn't really matter what programming environment you use. So things like MicroStation, AutoCAD, Rhino, and so on, all have the ability to put formulae like this, actually type them into the environment. Generative Components is the MicroStation version of that. I tend not to use those techniques because I find it simpler to use just C++. And if we've got time at the end, then I can talk in a bit more detail of how I do it. But so there are various different techniques. Every technique has advantages and disadvantages. Some techniques are easy to learn, some are more difficult to learn. Some techniques you learn once and then you can continue to use for 10, 20 years. Others change every year as a new operating system comes out and so on. So there's lots of detailed issues there. Then as a structural engineer, obviously the most important thing is whether the structure is going to collapse or not. And at this stage, this is where structural engineers hide away. They don't talk to architects in the sense that this is as a structural engineer, you have to be really, really pessimistic and negative in the sense you have to think about all the possible things that can go wrong. How many different ways can this roof collapse? How many different ways can a party of school children be killed by the roof coming down? I mean, you just really get depressed and sort of think about all the nasty things that can happen. And of course, when you do this, by and large, you don't do it when the architect is there or the client is there, because when you're with the architect or the client, you have to be sort of totally positive and enthusiastic and so on. So we go away and we worry about these things. But again, I think it's in some ways it's unfortunate that there is this distinction between architects and engineers, because this aspect of building, the sort of showing that everything works, is always been fundamental. I'll just show one more project. This is a more recent one. This is Savile Gardens with Glenn Howells. This is another timber grid shell in Windsor Great Park in England. And again, this is coming back to the technique for generating the shape. What the architects wanted is they wanted a sinusoidal, they wanted a shape which was like a wavy shape. And again, what we could have done is to said, well, okay, we'll go into Rhino and we'll start fiddling around with that and produce a shape like this. But again, I felt that's not the most elegant thing to do. It's also not necessarily the most practical thing to do, because the simpler the way in which your shape is defined, the easier it is to work out in detail the way everything intersects and work out the exact geometry. So this shape is very, very simple. It's just a cosine wave, which is multiplied by e to the minus x squared. E to the minus x squared is the normal distribution, the bell-shaped curve. So you take a bell-shaped curve and a cosine wave, and you multiply them together, and you get a cosine wave that dies out. And the nice thing about that is that you've only got a very small number of parameters. You've got the amplitude in the middle, you've got how fast does it decay as you move outwards, and you have the wavelength. So you've only got three things that you can change. And I think in some ways limiting your choice is more important than increasing your choice. You want to limit your choice so that the only choices you've got are good choices. And of course, if you've got a cosine wave and a bell-shaped curve, then in a way you've got rid of all the sort of wiggly bits. It's interesting talking to the people at Geary Technologies. That's Frank Geary's outfit. They use CATIA, which is comes from Dassault Systems, the French aerospace company. CATIA is used by people like Mercedes-Benz, Airbus, Peugeot, and so on and so forth. It comes out of the aerospace and automobile industries, and so Geary used that for their buildings. And of course, if you look at Geary buildings being constructed, you find that the inside of their buildings the structure is extremely complex. So there's all sorts of issues about things not bashing into each other in the same way that the hydraulic system of an aircraft is all sorts of things weaving in and out. But speaking to the people at Geary, they were saying, well, their tradition was to start with physical models, in the same way that working with Otto there's a tradition of working with physical models. But of course, if you measure a physical model, you measure everything about it. You measure both what is wanted, but you also measure the imperfections. So if there's a physical model of this, then you'd have a physical model which had this shape, but also had the imperfections. Now, it could be that you want to replicate those imperfections, or it could be that really those imperfections are something you want to eliminate. So in a sense, the worst thing with all of this is when you're trying to move from one medium to another, either from a physical model to a computer model, or a computer model in something like, in a sort of sculptural program like Rhino, to some more precise technique. It's at those stages that you're always not sure how much to try and replicate. I'll just talk a bit now about computers. I'm supposed to finish at 11, is that right? Yeah, right. This is the sort of computer that I used when I first started work at Arup. And in a way, the slide rule, there's the same relationship between the slide rule and an engineer as between the drawing board and an architect, in the sense that there was, up until recently, a physical relationship with the tools that you used. This is the sort of computer that I was taught to use as a student. It's an IBM 1130. And this is the sort of computer that we used on the Mannheim project in the 1970s. What's interesting about that is partly the fact that it's so big, and partly the fact that it's so expensive, in the sense that it would have been about $50 million in today's money. In a sense, this was the golden age of computing. Everything's been sort of downhill since then, because of course something like the lunar module, this would have been 1969, had computers on board to control the landing, or help control the landing. And those computers would have obviously had to be very, very small and or relatively small and relatively light. You couldn't have had something like this on board. And so the computers on board the lunar module would have been very, very slow, would have almost no storage. And so the people programming those computers would have had to have programmed them in an incredibly efficient way. The same applies more recently. This is an Apple Mac from, I guess it's the mid-80s, is it? Trying to remember. Early 90s? No, mid-80s. And this is the equivalent Windows machine. And both the Mac and the Windows machine used floppy disks. And I think the students here know what floppy disks are, don't you still? But I mean, well, in 5 years' time, you know, if I asked that question, they wouldn't know what a floppy disk was. So they had those floppy disks. Of course, the original floppy disks were floppy. They came in a sort of envelope, and they were floppy. But if you were lucky, you'd get the entire operating system, because these computers, the original ones, had no hard drive. You get the operating system, possibly also Microsoft Word, possibly also your documents, ideally on one floppy if you could, so you didn't have to keep on taking it in and out. One of those floppies is about 1 megabyte. So the whole operating system, Microsoft Word, and so on, is all on that one floppy. Whereas, of course, now there'd be many gigabytes of storage to have the same amount of information. So one of the things that people talk about is software bloat, which is where, as computers become more and more powerful, they just become clogged up with more and more complex operating systems and so on and so forth. This slide shows how computer speeds have changed. If we just compare this figure, the 6,000 in the bottom right, that's the relative speed of this Intel Core Duo Mac or equivalent Windows machine. Whereas the CDC 6600, the big computer we saw a moment ago, had a relative speed of 2. So this computer is about 3,000 times as fast as the CDC, which cost $50 million in today's money. The reason that I've shown this slide, again, it relates back to the software in the sense that when you buy a piece of software, or you buy a computer, or you buy anything, in a sense, this is sort of what you get. You get the flash image. You get the impression that this is something that's really, really good. However, if you look inside what's in the software, what's actually driving it, very often what you find is it's actually something like this. And certainly most engineering software is essentially pretty bad. You know, it's not very good. It's got inside it stuff like that. So never ever assume that because you've got a piece of software and it looks flash and other people are using it and so on and so forth, that it's any good. You have to assume that it's crap. You have to assume that the answers it gives you are wrong, and so on and so forth. And I'm just going to finish off in talking about computers and talking about fluid dynamics. This is some sketches by Leonardo. This is a photograph of water flow, of turbulent water flow. This is a satellite photograph of what's called a von Karman vortex street, and which has been shed by wind going past the island, which is on the top left. You get the same thing, of course, from buildings in the sense that downstream, if you've got a tall building, a tall tower, you get these vortices being shed from the tower. And that, of course, is why the tower in a wind sways sideways, left to right, rather than up and down the wind. You get the same thing with bridges. And it's effectively this sort of vortex shedding which caused the Tacoma Narrows Bridge to fail. This is a CFD image that I produced using essentially the same sort of technique in the sense that I used for that first program where the dots were moving around. But in this case, the dots, the white dots, which you can only just see, move around according to the laws of fluid dynamics. There's not just these dots, the whole space is full of dots. So there's black dots which you can't see, and then you see the white dots which have come off the cylinder. Now, so fluid dynamics, you generate highly complex patterns. This analysis took about a week to run on this computer. And there are a number of reasons why, even if computers get another 1,000 times more powerful, they still won't really be able to replicate what happens with airflow. There are physical reasons why airflow and turbulence is so complex that you will never really be able to simulate fluid flow with a computer. Right, so that's the end of my presentation. I could, if you're interested, talk in a bit more detail about some of the aspects of the way that I do my work, but I know that some of you won't find that interesting. There may be a few sort of anoraks amongst you. Do you know what an anorak is? It's like a geek who might be interested. Perhaps at this stage, before closing, I'll just mention, get another web page up, because we have the, what's it saying? I don't know. Oh dear, I have to do this again. Can you tell me what the, it's probably quicker if you do it. Right, good, thank you. I suppose firstly I could show you, this is the University of Bath webpage, and if you search around via the Department of Architecture and Civil Engineering, you'll come across my webpage, and in there I've got lots and lots of example pieces of software which you can try running. But that wasn't the reason I started the internet. The reason was to go to the Smart Geometry website. Now, Smart Geometry is essentially a group of people. The main drivers are Lars Hesselgren from KPF, firm of architects in America and London. Jay Paresh from Arup Sport, and Robert Aish originally from Bentley Systems, but now from Autodesk. And essentially what it is we have these conferences and workshops every year, and basically what they are engineers and architects from all over the world who are interested in the practical issues of computing in terms of design. Now that doesn't mean that all these people are expert programmers. In fact, many of them really don't know anything at all about computer programming. But I think what we all agree is that what's really important is that as engineers and architects, we have complete control over the tools that we use. In the same way that if you were a carpenter or a surgeon or whatever, you would be very, very concerned about the tools that you were using and how you were using, and you would have exactly the right tool for the job. I think in that context, you could argue that a lot of computer programs are like Swiss Army knives, that they have lots of features. They have, some sort of blade, they have a saw, they have scissors, they have a thing for taking stones out of horses' hooves, and so on. They have all these facilities, but they don't do any of them very well. So they're always a compromise. Whereas you could argue that, say, something like a scalpel is a much better knife. So if you were a surgeon, you would use a scalpel, and you wouldn't use a Swiss Army knife. And so it's that sort of philosophy that we want to have complete control over the over the computers, and ideally, what we have is the simplest possible tool that does exactly what you want. We want the equivalent of the scalpel. Also, I suppose our view is that there are people, obviously, who study mathematics and computer programming and things like that. And it may be that you will work with these people. But if you are going to work with people like that, you have to have some understanding of what it is that they do. Or you may decide you want to do it yourself. But what is certainly true, and that is that if you're interested in this sort of thing, what you should do is study architecture or engineering, because as an architect or an engineer, you can learn about computers. But if you're a mathematician or a computer scientist, you can't really become an architect. So you can move one way. You can move from being an architect to being a bit of an anorak or a bit of a geek, but you can't move the other way. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to look at this this web page. There are various sponsorship schemes for students and so on. Right, so I think it's now 11 o'clock, so I'll finish at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Is it all right for you to answer some questions?
Yes, certainly.
I'm sure there are going to be some. Gerald, perhaps I can...
I'm actually very curious, what are your inspirations, in the sense, could you name maybe 5 books which are in your cupboard, which are important to you?
Right.
You could think about it, maybe come back on it. Or
I guess you mean books about architecture and engineering?
Any books.
Right. That's a very difficult question. I guess there's a book by Dirac on general relativity, which is only about 50 pages long. It's a little grey book about that size, but that's not really that accessible. I suppose as an engineer, you have to start with Timoshenko, anything by Timoshenko, who was the, if you like, the father of engineering science, particularly in terms of structures, in the early part of the last century. His autobiography is very interesting as well. And also, he wrote a book on the history of strength of materials, where he describes how, I guess you've heard of people like Euler, as an Euler column formula and stuff like that, and people like Coulomb and so on. He describes how these people made their discoveries. And of course, what was really interesting then is that when you're a student of architecture or engineering, you learn a bit about structures and so on, and you learn about it in a particular order. And that order doesn't at all correspond to the order in which these concepts were discovered. And of course, the reason that they're taught in a different order is because the way that things are discovered doesn't, of course, necessarily correspond to a logical structure or to the way that you would want to learn something. I suppose when it comes to objects, I guess I would probably read about aircraft or ships or I don't know, be much more interested in the way things work, the way they're made. In particular, in the sense that the relationship between the way that they work and the way that they're made and the way that they look. I mean, in some ways, that's why I would find, say, Geary's architecture a little bit difficult to relate to, in the sense that there isn't quite the same connection between the two. But that's not to say that it's bad. It's just that for me, I suppose, looking at the animals, with the animal there is that relationship between the way it works and the way it looks. Although, of course, if you take something like a peacock, then you begin to struggle a bit.
The peacock has baffled everyone.
Yes, yes.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. Any other question? Yes, please. Michael Stacey, I believe.
I think I have a related question. As an architect who now finds it very difficult to remember the A-level maths that I actually did, I find your approach very interesting. But what would you recommend as a primer if someone wanted to sort of refresh their understanding of geometry?
Right. Okay. That's a good question. I think one of the interesting things about maths is that maths is an absolutely enormous field, and that even if you're a professional mathematician, you would only know one fraction of 1% of what there is to know about maths. So it's not a question of saying, I'm going to find out all about maths, and then I'm going to use that particular bit. You have to rely on serendipity. In other words, sort of stumbling across something which you find interesting. I think also, of course, professional mathematicians, by and large, are not interested in geometry in 3 dimensions, because it's sort of, from a mathematical point of view, it's sort of trivial. You've got to be in 10 dimensions or something before it becomes interesting to them. So, in a sense, professional mathematicians are really not that interested in this. What we're doing is very simple geometry, but we're doing it in a very large scale, which is what makes it interesting. I suppose what we're talking about is analytic geometry, in the sense that that everything has to be defined in terms of the x, y, z coordinates of points, or we're talking about curves, or we're talking about surfaces. But But to say what is the best book, it's very difficult to say. I mean, it depends on how much calculus you know. If you're interested in curves, then calculus, which is how things change, is of fundamental importance. If you're interested in objects which are not curved, but in sense made of straight lines, then calculus is not relevant at all, and you might be interested in some sort of random process, say, for generating series of lines. If you're interested in curves and surfaces, then that subject is differential geometry. And there are many, many books on it. I suppose the best or most accessible book on differential geometry is by Struick, Lectures on Classical Differential Geometry, where he talks about minimal surfaces and all these sort of types of things. But I think you just have to rely on luck. Perhaps you go to the library or something like that. You leaf through some books, see if you can find any pictures that interest you. And sometimes there's some very old books that are interesting, which might have just lots of pictures of curves, and you say to yourself, I like that curve. You then see the formula for the curve, and there are pieces of software which can allow you to type formulae in, either using C++, or on the Mac there's a thing called Grapher. I don't know if there's anything on PCs where you just type in the formula and you get the shape.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have one more question. Well, no, not you, Gerald, sorry. There, right at the back. Let me bring you on. There you are.
Thanks. I would wonder if your après discussion might have been calibrator. I'll defer to the better French speakers in the room. The question that I had is that a lot of the examples of shell studies and of other complex curvature derive from minimal material usage or from some sort of optimization of the material, at times from sort of mid-century when material is very expensive. And I'm curious how you find ways of optimizing or of making these constructible systems better in an economy where labor is very expensive and that the material optimization is not quite of the same constraint.
Right.
I work on graphic static optimization at MIT, and so I'm curious, this is a challenge that we run into.
Right.
And I'm curious what your take is on that.
Right, okay. I think the concept of optimization is very interesting. I mean, people like Michael Braun, who's a professor at Bath University, where I come from, he would talk about Karl Popper and Karl Popper's paradigm of the design process in terms of a cyclical process where you improve the design bit by bit. My feeling is that on real projects you tend to have too many parameters. So in the case of the British Museum, for example, the main parameter was the size of the glass sheets. And it was the size of the glass sheets, or the maximum size of the glass sheets, which determined the whole structural grid. So in that sense, we were working within very tight constraints. I think, incidentally, actually, we were very lucky there, because if we'd found that you could have had bigger sheets of glass, we would have had a coarser grid. We would have had longer members, larger triangles, and instead of having a roof where it almost looks like continuous curved members, we would have got to the stage where it would look like big triangles with straights. So in a sense, we were lucky there that there was a constraint which forced us to have a relatively fine grid. Because, of course, from the structural point of view, the coarser the grid, the better, because a small number of big members is more efficient than a large number of small members. I think what's really interesting about it is that we had the problem with the corners, as I described, and so that you run the computer analysis, and the computer analysis tells you that there's a problem in the corners. Now at this stage, I suppose ideally what you would have is some automated process which would somehow, either using a genetic algorithm or using some sort of other minimization technique, would sort of search around for an answer. But we didn't do that, partly because it just, there wasn't the computer power to do that. But also I think that one of the things that the human mind is good at is that you're given a set of circumstances, and then you try and understand what's going on, and you look at the problem in an overall sense. Also, I think when it comes to optimization, if you've got some sort of curve of, say, cost against, or weight or something against some parameter, then you've got maybe some sort of U-shaped curve. And by definition, if you're sort of at the optimum, then you're right at the bottom of the curve. But also it means that if you move a little bit either way, it doesn't make that much difference. But what you want to make sure is that you're not way up on this, you're not up like that. So to a certain extent, the aim is to get sufficiently near to some sort of optimum, but you don't really mind how near you are, because if you move slightly away from the optimum, then it doesn't make much difference. So I think certainly as part of the design process, some sort of optimization might be appropriate. And of course that process might be part of your form generation. I mean, certainly in the case of Frei Otto had the idea that things like minimal surfaces and hanging chains were optimum. Well, in a sense, they are sort of optimum, but they're only optimum in certain ways, in the sense that for a lightweight structure like the Mannheim grid shell, the worst load case is snow. And of course, that's a different load case to that of the hanging chain. So I think that certainly the idea of optimization has its place in the design process, but that it's very much up to the individual designer to interpret that in the way that he or she thinks is appropriate. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Right. Well, I'm afraid I know there are going to be more questions. I'm full of them myself, but I'm not going to allow you to ask them. I think those anoraks who have more questions should try and assault you during coffee, during our coffee break, so that we can have a short rest before Ken Yang's lecture at 11:30. All right, so it's going to be a short coffee break. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, when the conference began 2 days ago with a lecture by John Thackeray, it was about how to cope in a world where resources would have to be mapped in order to be made use of, where time would have to be used very, very efficiently in order to cope with the pressures of daily life in a post-industrial, what did he call it? Post-economical world. A world which could no longer sustain the world as we know it now. And he suggested that we should adapt. And what that adaptation exactly meant, he didn't tell us. And for good reason, because he, like us, cannot exactly see into the future. Today, I feel extremely honored to be standing here, welcoming a speaker who's come all the way from Malaysia on a flight. We had a steward going out 4 o'clock this morning to collect him from the airport, travel back with him by train so as to miss the traffic jams on the way. It seemed like a sort of James Bond logistics thing, you know. And we enjoyed that simple fact of having to do it that way. And the buzz, the electricity in the air, I think, is measurable. My dear colleague Rob, who has chaired the organization of this conference, for the first time said, I think I'm feeling a bit nervous. I'm feeling butterflies in my tummy. I don't know why. And I knew why, because he'd been looking forward particularly to this lecture. This lecture is not just Faculty of Building, Planning and Architecture thing. It was organized by the faculty, by GEOPS, and by Studium Generale, who were very generous to welcome Ken Young to the floor. Please.
Thanks very much. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What an introduction. Him and my mum must have something in common. Could you just switch off the lights, please? Now, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you about the work that I've been doing for the last maybe 30, 40 years. I started to become involved with green design in the early 70s when it wasn't fashionable then. It's also to me, a very big subject, and I will not be able to cover everything today. So what I'll do is just to go through some ideas that have been preoccupying me, and we'll talk about my approach to green design, which may interest some of you and which may disappoint others. So the title of my talk today is about green design and the ideas that I have. Now, I'm not just an architect, I'm also an ecologist. So I study ecology and I'm a member of the British Ecological Society. Ecologists see the world as having units within it, which are called ecosystems. And ecosystems consist of communities of plants and animals and the physical environment, or if you like, biotic components and abiotic, and the ecosystems defined as consisting of biotic and abiotic components acting together to form a whole. Forming this whole is extremely important because holistic property is one of the key features of ecosystems. If we look at architecture and its environment, then this simple diagram shows the building, if you like, as the built system with definable boundaries and the environment to it, which is essentially the biosphere. Now, the environment to any building that you put on a site consists of its local ecosystems, where it's located, where it is constructed. Then this exists within the biosphere, which has its own climatic processes that takes place around it. And then we make use of the world's, the global energy material resources. And of course, our built system exists in the context of other built systems. The relationship between the system and environment in this simple general systems theory model is inputs and outputs. The built system, our architecture, takes in huge inputs and gives out outputs. Inputs consist of energy, materials, and people getting to the building, leaving the building, and then outputs are energy, materials, and people, and the built system itself. At the end of the day, the building has to go somewhere. Instead of going to a landfill, ideally what we need to do is to reuse and recycle and reintegrate. But the built system itself, the buildings that we create, have three levels of impacts on the environment. The first impact, as a result of the creation of the construction of that work of architecture, then has an impact during its operational life, and has an end environmental impact, and then its life has to go somewhere. Now, at each of these stages, the first impact, operational, and end, It takes an input of energy, materials, and people, gives out outputs of energy, materials. And each of these relationships have an impact on the local ecosystems, on the biosphere, climatic processes, on the global energy, material resources, and the existing built environment. So in a nutshell, these are for me the key considerations in eco-design. And so eco-design, designing green buildings, as Kermit the Frog in Sesame Street says, it's not easy being green. So sometimes when I pick up a magazine and I see some incredibly famous architect saying that he's designed a green building, then it distresses me a little bit because it could be misleading to others in the sense that he has done something which is in some way green, which may have been experimentally important green, may have contributed towards creating a green future, but it is, there are a lot of other considerations that you have to take into account in designing green buildings. Now, I see green buildings as, in some ways, similar to prosthetic design. So here's a young lady with a prosthetic arm, and it is totally artificial. And everything centers around the effectiveness of how the prosthetic device, prosthetic thing, connects to its host organism. And so here's a poor gentleman with, prosthetic hands, prosthetic legs, prosthetic kneecap, artificial heart, and so forth. And that the success of a prosthetic device depends entirely on how it interacts with its host organism, which is the human body. So with this as the analogy, our buildings, if you like, the host organism is the biosphere. And everything centers around this integration between the building, the artificial component, and its host organism. So this is how I see green design. I see green design is essentially one of biointegration. In principle, if we're able to integrate everything that we make, everything that we do as human beings with the natural environment, with the biosphere, then we wouldn't have any environmental problems. And so a seamless and benign integration is absolutely essential. Obviously, this is easier said than done because it's not so easy to achieve this. So herein lies the challenge for us as human beings, how to integrate what we do, what we make, with the natural environment in a seamless and benign way. In a nutshell, that is what green design is to me. Now, what exactly does biointegration mean? So for me, there are three levels of integration: physical, systemic, and temporal. Let me just elaborate on what this means. Physical means integrating with existing features and ecology of the environment. That means every site that you locate a building, whether it's within a city, within the suburb, or right on a countryside, on a greenfield site or a brownfield site, there are existing features that exist in the ecosystem, and we have to integrate seamlessly and benignly with these features. Otherwise, something will happen to the environment. We would probably might have lost particularly important species. We might have affected the groundwater. It might cause erosion and so forth. And so the first level of integration is integrating with the existing features and ecology of the locality. Systemic integration is integrating with the processes, because nature in ecosystems, they're very complex processes. There's climatic processes, and integrating systemically with the environment, with the ecosystems, processes, and the biosphere process is important. And finally, I call this temporal integration, means integrating our rate of consumption, our rate of use of resources, and their rate of renewal over time. And so to me, these are the three levels of integration. I will not be able to cover all of them in great detail today, but I will just discuss some of these and how I've tried to address this integration in the work that I've been involved in. Physical integration. Now, going back to what I said earlier on, if we were to integrate everything we do with the ecosystem of the locality, then it sounds like an impossible task, because as an ecologist, you know that to understand the ecology of a location, it is not something that you can do in a day. can't do it in a week, in a month. You have to do it diurnally over seasons of the year. And sometimes, some ecologists, where it takes several years to even understand the state of succession of a particular ecosystem, the energy flows, the species biodiversity, and so forth. And so as architects, designers, and engineers, we don't have the luxury of time to understand an ecosystem in full. And so around the 60s, people like Ian McHarg from the University of Pennsylvania started to develop what they call the ecological land use planning technique, where they break down the ecosystem in a series of layers in terms of geology, hydrology, physiography, soils, and so forth, and start to map these horizontally and do what they call the layer cake method for understanding the ecology of the locality. Now, we have to be very careful that while this is, if you like, a shorthand, a quick method to understand ecology, there are very complex interactions between each of these layers. For instance, geology interacts with the climate and the soils of locality and the hydrological processes and so forth. And so while this is a quick method we can use to understand the ecology of location, there are very complex relationships, vertical relationships, that we have to be aware of. So now, we map the soils, hydrology, vegetative topography, and geology, and so forth. And on the right-hand side are some of the maps that you would do. And then you do a summary map, put a grid over it, assign points. And eventually what you have on the right-hand side is a composite sensitivity map, which then the planner or the architect could use as a guide, only as a guide, for locating his roads, locating his buildings, locating looking at the landscaping, determining what sort of activities can take place that will not significantly affect the ecology of location. I actually have a series of categories for different types of sites and what sort of strategy you have. I don't have a checklist today. But this is an example of a scheme. This is our proposal for the extension for the University of Nottingham. And these are some of the maps we did, very simplistically because we didn't have time to do a full mapping exercise. On the bottom right-hand side is the composite map. And the composite map tells us that, yes, we can locate buildings on the red parts of the site, never on the blue, and with care on the orange parts of the site. And on the right-hand side, you can see the master plan and how this correlates with the composite map on the left-hand side. This is the master plan we did for a site in Mecca. You can see the holy area at the bottom. These are the maps that we've done for the project. We're looking at the slope, looking at topography, looking at the ridges, looking at parts of the site that we can locate buildings. And the composite map is on the bottom left-hand corner. And the idea in this project is to have an ecological corridor that links the holy area right to its hinterland and to locate the buildings within the topography and within the lie of the land while managing the water resources at the same time, or the drainage or surface water or whatever there is on that site within this locality. So you can see the topography on the left-hand side and the master plan on the right-hand side. This is the ecological corridor and the fingers that extend into the built environment. Systemic integration is integrating with the processes of the locality. So this is a scheme that we designed in Istanbul. There's a competition that we won where we started to look at the ecological processes and what happens in the ecology of that location. On the left-hand side, in that red square, is our competition site. What you see on the right-hand side in red are the urbanized areas. The brown are the existing vegetation. And this is what has happened over the last 100 years. Our human community have started to eat and eat and eat and eat into the countryside until the ecosystem has been virtually split or dissected. And so our idea in this particular scheme was to try and reconnect the ecosystem, trying to make the ecosystem whole again so that it is brought back together into one single ecosystem. The idea we had to do this, to achieve this, because there are existing roads and buildings on that site, is what we call the ecological bridge. Now, the idea is very simple. If you have two sites, A and B, which are separated by a highway, what happens if you bridge across this highway and you vegetate it and you landscape it? Then straight away what you've done is this. You have increased the ecological nexus, the connectivity between one part of the site with the other part of the site, enabled and improved ecosystem integration between the species, and enable a greater sharing of resources within the habitat, encourages increase in species diversity, and forms a larger ecosystem rather than fragments it. And generally, ecologists contend that by increasing the biodiversity and increasing its connectivity engenders a much more stable ecosystem. So with this idea, we started to work on the possibility of having a series of layers. We have the road below, then the ecological bridges, then the mass transit system on top of that. So altogether, we have a sort of mapping, interweaving of these different layers. So here you are, here's the project. And what we have is this huge highway that runs across the site, and these are where the ecological bridges are, so that in this way we have reconnected and reassembled the whole site back together to form an ecosystem. But to justify this, we said to the organizers that we're going to make this into the single biggest park that Istanbul can ever have. And so we start to map different activities and start to locate these activities so that this commercially justifies, the bridges. And essentially the system is one of bringing the ecosystem on the left-hand side, on the northeast, connecting to that on the northwest, southeast to the southwest, and so forth. So now, I started to look at the processes that takes place in an ecosystem. Ecosystems have a composition of both biotic and abiotic components. Everything in the ecosystem is recycled. The food from one organism becomes, the waste from one organism becomes food from another. There's no such thing as waste in nature. In nature, everything's recycled. Energy is entirely from the sun, whereas our human community, the energy comes from fossil fuels. And there's a high level of species biodiversity as an ecosystem develops. So these are some of the characteristics and properties of ecosystems. Now what we've done is that our human-built environment is a throughput system. We take something, use it, and throw it away. And we're dependent on, nothing's recycled, or there's a minimal recycling. And so if we were to achieve a stasis, a stability, a sustainable future in our human-built environment, my contention is that we should imitate, in as much as possible, the properties and processes of the ecosystem, so that what we design and what we build are human-made ecosystems. In the same way that we have a prosthetic device, which is a statute host organism, we should try and make our prosthetic system as close as we can to the organic system that it replaces. Now, if we take the simple property of a composition of biotic and abiotic components, then every ecosystem has a community of plants and animals and a physical environment. However, in our human-built environment, if we take this room as an example, everything in this room is inorganic, except you and me and the bacteria. So where is the community of plants and animals? So this was one of the things that struck me when I started to look at ecological design. And I said one of the things we have to do in trying to create a balanced ecosystem, or human-made ecosystem, is to bring in the communities of plants and animals, but not just bring it in, try and integrate these two together. And so with this idea, we started to look in different ways of integrating the human-made with the natural. I started to look at prosthetic systems, artificial ears and eyes, and started to look at different ways of integration. And it struck me that if we continue to build in the way that we have been, then what you get is the human being on the right-hand side. Everything, this whole world will become artificial. This whole world that we live in will become inorganic. And so we started looking at different ways of bringing organic systems back into the community. One of the ways, I started to diagram this. And so you can either put, in terms of planning, this is a map actually of Manhattan. You can either put all the green in one location, just like that. Or you can have a dispersed planting system, like in Georgian London, different squares, like Tavistock Square, Bedford Square, Houston Square. Or you have continuous planting, like an ecological corridor with fingers. In terms of buildings, again, you can put it on one location, have a spotty relationship, which I call intermixing, or a much more weaving relationship, as you can see on the right-hand side. Again, the ecologists prefer the last two diagrams because, again, it enables a greater linking of the ecosystems within the, linking of the species with each other, and a greater integration with the physical environment. So, back to the ecological bridge. This is a master plan that we did for a site in China, right at the waterfront. The larger blue parts that you see are parts of the site that our client doesn't own. But the site has some very beautiful knolls and little hillocks within it. And these squares show where the ecological bridges are. And so this is the master plan. The squares show the ecological bridges. And for me, this is as close as I could get to an ideal ecological master plan, in the sense that we have not flattened the whole site. We've kept the hills. We work on the flattest part of the sites. And we have not fragmented the site. We have enabled development to take place and maintain the integrity of the site and the connectivity within the site. And so this is, for me, a systemic integration of the built environment with the natural environment. Then I started to look at, well, it's not enough to link above ground. We should bring things all the way down to the ground as well, into the below ground. So one of the ideas I had was to have in each building what I call the eco zone, where technology could be added to it, but the technology we brought in changes over time. So we must be able to design the building so that the technology could be taken out and put back again as it advances and develops. And so the eco zone would be a void, a slot that we cut into the building all the way down to the basement, and this enables the vertical integration of biomass from the roof all the way down to all floors, down to the basement. Then it would provide opportunities for rainwater harvesting. It would provide opportunities for natural ventilation in the inner parts of the building, for opportunities to bring daylight, and finally for recycling of sewage and for grey water collection. This is a scheme that we designed for the waterfront in Kowloon, and it was a competition that we didn't win. Lord Norman won the competition. And within our scheme, these are where the eco cells are. These are where the voids that we cut into the building. And so the diagram for this is we first take the building carcass, we covered it with a rooftop garden, mounded the edges so the roof links to the adjoining sites, sandwich integration in between the floors, insert vegetation into the middle. And what you have is both horizontal vertical integration in the composite drawing on the bottom. There's another view of the site. The square shows where the eco cells are, and the arrow shows the ecological bridge that connects to Kowloon Park. So in this way, we again create for Hong Kong the single largest park you can ever have. This is the view of the development. We put all the towers in intensive development at the far ends of the site. And here it is in the context of the city. The tall buildings by KPF. An example of this is what we did in the National Library in Singapore. You can see the eco cell on the left-hand side. This is taken from the ground plane. And within the eco cell, in the basement, you can see daylight coming in, and people using that space below. And so it's actually quite a pleasurable space to be in. This square shows where the eco cells are. And this is a summary of plans of the building, and these are locations where we have the eco cells. At the upper parts of the building, we would have sky courts of about 40 meters high, with trees which are about 3 meters high. And you can see these are some of the sky courts to bring biodiversity and vegetation back into the built environment. That's a rooftop view of the building. The average building in Singapore, the commercial building in Singapore, uses 230 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. at the design stage, we said we're trying to achieve 170, and upon completion, we got 162, so we got a lower energy than what we promised in the first place, and the building received the Singapore Platinum Award for Green Buildings. So here it is, another scheme that we designed in Abu Dhabi. Here's another competition that we won, but hasn't gone ahead. Again, trying to link the green vegetation on the ground all the way up to the building, into the podium roof, right to the rooftop of the building in this sort of ziggurat pattern. So here's the green scheme, eco-cell that brings the vegetation up, all the way up to the roof, and then the podium is the eco-walk, which is specified in the competition brief. That's the facade of the building, and that's the rooftop of the building, and this is the master plan of the site, showing the 5 towers and the vegetation over the entire development. Another scheme that we designed for a tower in Kuwait, this time we had enclosed atriums because of the hostile climate, and this time we wanted to create sky courts in the top of the building. And so these are sort of environment we want to create. For those who are interested in the process, we started shaping the building using a software called Blender, which you can actually get from the internet for free. Then having shaped the building, we graduated the floors. And then having graduated the floors, we sliced the model to get the floor plans, inserted the lift core, then recreated the model again using Rhino, and then test efficiency of the building, made it work structurally, and recreate and reconstruct the model using 3D Studio. These are sort of spaces that we want to create in the upper parts of the building. A building that we did maybe about 10, 15 years ago is this small building, this tower in London, in Kuala Lumpur, where we wanted to put vegetation on the facade. And this was the building when it's completed in its full glory. And to me, this is what a green building could be. I think a green building should look explicitly green. What I find distressing sometimes when I go around town and somebody says to me, oh, that's a green building done by so-and-so. And then my friend who's not an architect would say, well, you know, what's so green about it? Because it doesn't look like green building, it looks like any other building that is, you know, similar or built further down the street. So I think explicitness is extremely important, because it brings across the message that if you're going to have a green building, it should look green. And this image for me is evocative of what a green building should look like. It is not pristine, it is fuzzy at the edges. I call it hairy. And when this was completed, somebody said it was the hairiest building in the world. Here it is with all the fuzziness around the edges. But the experiment in this structure was not a continuous green building, continuous greening. It was a disparate sort of series of terraces, and it was another experiment for me. We also made sure that the lift cores and elevators are naturally ventilated so that you don't have to pressurize it. And here's the building in the context of the city. The idea of integrating fascinated me, and so I started to look in different ways for doing this vertically. And this, if you like, is a diagram of the ideal relationship where we had a continuous ramp weaving its way up to the top of the building. And I started to look at ways of connectivity of bringing the greening up the tower. One of the ideas I had was to have a series of planter boxes with terraces, and the planter box would have a gravity-fed system that would feed water and fertilizer into these planter boxes. This was a building that I did in the late 80s for IBM, and we had a series of step planters going around the facade on one side, then goes up to the middle of the floor, goes across the floor, turns around, and goes up to the other part of the building. Another scheme would be this tower that we did in Singapore, like a series of newspapers or magazines with a less rotated floor. We had a ramp that weaves its way up to the top of the building, and within the ramp would be greenery and sky courts. And here's the image of the building. The site is what I call an urban site, a zero culture site. And so we started to take a radius of about 500 meters around the site to map its vegetation, so that the vegetation we bring back into the site will not be alien to its locality, and that the concept would be to bring the building vegetation weaving all the way up the top, and where we have the opportunities for sky court, we would open up into a sky court. Another project we worked on is this complex of buildings in Germany, where the idea was to have rather than have parks surrounded by buildings, we wanted to create a park first and the buildings underneath, on top of that, with ecological bridges going across from one part of the site to the other part of the site. It's a assemblage of the buildings and the main towers on the right-hand side. The diagram, if you like, the ideogram of the towers on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is the actual design. The idea was to have a complex vertical programs within a tower and not just all of the ground floor or the mid-level, to have a series of multiple parks within that building, large parks, smaller parks, and pocket parks, and to have different levels of circulation system from primary, secondary, and tertiary system. Now, another property that we started to look at in the ecosystems is this high level connectivity. So I started to look into systems of connectivity, ways we can connect the vegetation and the natural and the biomass with the built system. So this connectivity became a topic for us. We had started earlier on in the IBM system. We had this system of step planters to connect the vegetation with the building. A more recent scheme is the scheme that we designed for the University of Hong Kong, where this time we had a series of weaving patterns, like a series of staircases for planters that starts from the park at the back of the site, climbs its way up, weaving its way up, and where there are opportunities to eat into the building to create sky courts or green areas, we've done that, and then work its way up to a roof garden on the top. That's the plan for the site. The building that you see is on the left-hand side. There are a number of existing trees within that site which we are not allowed to cut, and so we had to shape the buildings or the two blocks in such a way that we're able to get the two buildings of particular intensity and built-up area, and yet not cut down any of the trees. A more recent scheme for a site in Vietnam, and this time what we had is a series of planters which work up along the side of the building, goes to the top, and then goes down again on the other side of the building. This is another scheme that we recently designed in Istanbul, and this time the system we had is a series of eco-ramps, eco-bridges, ramps, eco-walls, and then roof gardens. And so in this way, there's a total integration of the natural and the human-made in one single scheme. Now, temporal integration is the rate of integrating with the rate of consumption with our use of natural resources. So low energy design is part of eco-design. So it's a subsystem, if you like, of eco-design. And so we started to look into how to design low energy building, and this, if you like, a method that we use. Now, to me, if we don't have to improve the conditions of comfort inside the building to what is in the outside, then we don't need buildings. And so creating low energy design is, to me, different modes of environmental control. For me, there are 5 modes: passive mode, mixed mode, full mode, productive mode, and composite mode. And if you like, these are progressive stages that you could go through before you can put in engineering systems. Passive mode is improve comfort conditions without the use of any mechanical electrical systems. So if you look into the native dwellings, for instance, if you're in Eindhoven here, we should start to look at the native dwellings that were built, a few hundred years ago when they didn't have electricity. And you find that these buildings, through trial and error, through intuition, people have been able to build comfortable buildings which are more comfortable on the inside than on the outside, without the use of any mechanical electrical systems, for instance, like using thick walls or using thatch roofs and so forth. And so to me, design must start with optimizing all passive mode. So optimizing passive mode is, if you like, if you want to use another word for it, is bioclimatic design. That means designing with the climate of locality. You have to understand the seasons of the year, you have to understand the sun path, understand the wind rows, and so forth. Mixed mode means some mechanical electrical systems, like a double skin facade or a flue atrium. And full mode will be a building like this, which is 100% control, 100% control of air change, humidity, and so forth. And productive mode is where you start to generate your own energy, and composite mode would be a different mode for different seasons of the year. I had a conversation with a futurologist in the US the other day, Rodney Hill from Texas A&M University, and he says that his view is that within the next 10 years, no buildings will be approved by the local authorities if it doesn't generate its own source of energy. Now, if you think about it, there might be, there's a very likelihood of this happening because, as you know, petrol, oil now is at $100 a barrel, highest it's ever been. We're past the halfway mark in our use of these oil resources, and the oil is not going to get any cheaper, it's going to get increasingly more expensive, and that we have to start to design buildings which are not just low energy, but has to regenerate its own source of energy. And that will radically change architectural design. And so productive mode is actually a very important mode to consider, sometimes no longer as a sort of fourth step in this diagram, but maybe right at the outset. So strategically, when you design low energy buildings, what I do is that I start by shaping the building, adopt all the passive mode strategies before going to energy mode, because in this way, in the case of a brownout, then the building remains comfortable to occupy. But if you don't, then the buildings become uncomfortable to occupy, then you have to move somewhere else. And so strategically, you have to optimize all the passive mode, then you go into mixed mode, full mode, then you look at productive mode and composite mode. Now, if you look into a climate like you have here in Eindhoven, you have a very cold winter, and you have hot summer, which is that dotted line on the under part of this graph. By optimizing our passive mode strategies, you can improve the comfort conditions a little bit. So then you see the solid line after the dotted line, and that is passive mode. Mixed mode can improve it even further, but full mode would be that line in the middle. That means if you insist on consistent temperature, humidity, air change, and so forth throughout the whole year, then what you have is full mode. Now, what this diagram informs us is that there is no way that passive mode can ever compete with full mode. No way that mixed mode can compete with full mode. And at the end of the day, low energy design is not the realm of the architect or the engineer, but it's you as people. You are the people who determines the comfort conditions. So if you're prepared to wear warmer clothes in winter, then you can lower down the heating. If you wear lighter clothes in summer, or run around starkers in summer, then you use less air conditioning. And so quantitatively, that's what it means. That a full mode building will probably occupy anything between 200 to maybe 400 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. An average office building in Singapore, as I mentioned earlier on, uses 270 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. And the other day I was in Canary Wharf, and I was in a building which is occupied by a bank, in which systems are never switched off, and that building uses 1,400 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. Mixed mode would be using between maybe 50 to maybe 30, 40 to maybe 50 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum, and passive mode will be between 30 to maybe 60. The Building Research Establishment recommends for temperate climates to try and achieve a standard for offices of 100 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. So passive mode strategy must optimize all the options before we go on to other modes. Now, many books have been written about designing with climate, and we forgot about this. Schools have stopped teaching this after the 50s. For those architects who were trained in the 50s, it was second nature to us to design with climate. People like Richard Neutra, Otto Königsberger at the AA Tropical School, we were taught how to design climate. But then with low energy in the 60s, everything went out the window, literally out the window. And so, architects were taught that we don't have to worry about climatic conditions, air conditioning and heating, and take care of all of that. So many books have written like this, especially by the All-J brothers and by Maxwell Fine Jane Drew. And these are some of the strategies for designing passive mode or bioclimatic buildings by proper shaping of the building, by appropriate orientation of the buildings, by facade design and solar control devices and so forth. Even the color of the building is important. For instance, studies have shown by the Lawrence Berkeley laboratory in California that white buildings in hot climates in California are lower in energy consumption than a dark-colored or a black-colored building. This was a building that we did in the 90s. It's the second building we did for IBM, and it was, for us, an experiment in passive mode. We started to look at the Sun Park locality. We started to shape the building so that we put a core on the hottest part of the site, and that the core is on the outside, so it has natural ventilation and daylight coming in. By doing this, we don't have to pressurize the lift lobby and the staircases. We look at different options. The first option is the building as is built with a core to one side on the hot side of the building. Option 2 is the build core in the middle, and option 3 is the core to the north. We took an index, which is OTTV, which is basically a formula, and it stands for overall thermal transmission value. And that you can see the one on the left-hand side is 43.3 watts per square meter, the one on the second is 47.5, and the third is 47.6. What this diagram informs us is that shaping of the building, back to this set of this checklist, that by shaping the building and proper orientation, then we're heading towards a low-energy building. Now, if we don't, then the systems that we put in afterwards, the engineering system we put in, have to correct the wrong orientation or the wrong shaping, which then makes total nonsense to design low-energy buildings. So low-energy design has to start with proper orientation and shaping. And so, so with this building, we also had a series of sky cots that stepped all this way up to the top of the building. And the root thing, the little sort of thing that sticks out rudely on the top left-hand corner is actually the swimming pool or the recreational floor in the upper parts of the building. This is a more recent tower that we designed in Kuala Lumpur. And our work sometimes, our design approach sometimes starts with an idea of how to make the building cool and how to make the building low energy. So this is the typical floor of the building. And the idea was to have a series of shafts on the inside that could naturally ventilate the kitchens and the toilets at the back of the apartment units so that we don't have to mechanically ventilate them. So the idea was to have these shafts in the middle, have a wind catcher at the bottom, and a wind catcher on the top of the building, or wind scoop, so that we could bring wind into the parts of the building. So we got one of my colleagues to simulate this, and she looked at she and her team look at the effects of wind and the incidence on the flatter parts of the site and on the narrow parts of the building. So this was the results they came out with. And you can see the comfort zone is between that light blue and that dark yellow, and you can see the colors on the inside of between the two blocks, and you can see that the building is generally within acceptable comfort conditions. And this was at the design stage. And so embarrassingly, after the building was completed, we found that it was effective only for the lower part of the building because the client took away the wind scoop at the upper part of the roof, and we weren't able to bring the wind into the upper parts of the towers. Here's the facade without the sunshades. Now, originally when we had the sunshades, the client says he didn't want the sunshades, and so we said, all right, let's study the effects of sunshade, and we showed that by having the sunshades, we had a generally cooler building during the hottest time of the day. So these were the graphs that we did with the university team. And what you see in the blue graph is that between the hottest time of the day, between 2 o'clock to about 6 o'clock, you can see the comfort conditions shooting all the way up right to the top. And then once we put the sunshades in, the comfort condition is that red graph at the bottom. And so we showed this to the client again and says, all right, let's put the sunshades back in. And sure enough, when he launched for sales, purchasers are not stupid. People who buy buildings will say, we don't want the building facing the west side because it's going to be very hot. So the client brought our graphs into the marketing office and showed the purchasers and say, so the graphs actually did help him sell the apartments. This is a recent scheme that we designed in Singapore. This time we had the vegetation weaving its way around all the way around from one part of the site and going up to the other part, right to the roof garden. And this is another view of the project, seen from the northeast. There's a cross-section through the scheme, and that what we have is an air well that goes all the way up in the middle between the two blocks, and one that goes diagonally from the outside right to the top of the atrium. This is a competition that we did win. I have this little room in my office, which I call the project cemetery, where all the projects will never get built or competition that we lost. This is for a housing project consisting of offices and apartments and a mosque right in the middle. Another scheme that we designed in London, which is the extension for the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. And we believe that this will be the greenest hospital in the UK. It's right at the edge of the site. As you know, it's not easy. We just got plenty of approval. In the UK, you have to go through Cape, you have to go through Camden, you have to go through Westminster, English Heritage, and with this scheme, we had to go through the Mayor as well. So finally, we have got the scheme through. But with this project, it was rated BREEAM, which is the British Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment. It has a target of 77%, which is excellent. And that the mechanical electrical systems we put in the building is extensive. You can see all the amenity systems, mechanical system technology we put in. But to me, this is not just green design. Green design is not just mechanical systems, but all the other sort of ecological aspects that we have to put into the building. So to conclude, running out of breath, running out of energy myself, there are many certification systems in the world. You have to LEED in the UK, in the US, BREEAM in the UK, CASP in Japan, Green Globe in Canada, and so forth. But these are just indexes. And so don't be misled by this. Sometimes you meet an architect who says, oh, I'm a LEED accreditor, or I'm a LEED architect. I've done a building which is LEED Platinum. But you remember that these are just rating systems. And so if you're going back to the model that I showed earlier on, the LEED, all of these rating systems are not comprehensive. It only covers part of what this ecological design is all about. And so, don't be misled by these. These are nothing more than just indexes. It's like saying, oh, here's a nice guy, and this is not such a nice guy, and this is a terrible man, that sort of thing. It's just generalizations. And so just to remind you, eco-design is about integration, physically, systemic, and temporally, in a seamless and benign way with the natural environment. And this is our challenge. If we're able to integrate everything that we make and we build with the natural environment in a seamless, benign way, physically, systemically, and temporally, and what we have will be there won't be any environmental problems at all. And so this is a challenge that we all must address and work together as architects and designers and engineers. But even with integration, there are many ways to integrate. For instance, even with an artificial lake, there are two systems here. Now, if we take the most complex and most difficult integration problem that we have, which is the artificial heart, then you find that artificial heart is not, we still haven't achieved the ideal artificial heart. There's only about 60% success rate of successful artificial heart. And there are other problems. We still haven't been able to power the artificial heart using the energy of body. You still have to use batteries. And the batteries have to recharge, you have to do this magnetically. And even with the artificial heart, the motor itself within the heart gives out energy, which affects the host organism. And so we have a long way to go before we can truly integrate everything that we make and do as human beings with the natural environment. Again, this is, if you like, the M&E engineers in the wet dream, where he thinks that if you start to build technology with solar cells and things, you have green energy, you have green building. I think yes, I think these are systems that can lead towards an eventual green building, but it's not in its entirety green. There are other considerations that we take into account. Integrating with biomass is one of them, and imitating the processes, the ecosystems, is another. So today I've been able to cover the composition of abiotic components. We have to look into recycling materials, how we can do this in our built environment, how to design using energy from the sun, how to design increasing species diversity and so forth. So these are other things that we need to develop and work on as architects and technologists. Levels integration, fiscal, systemic, temporal, integrating with the physical existing features and ecology of the environment, systemically integrating with the ecosystems and the biosphere, and temporally integrating with the rate consumption of non-renewable resources.
Ken Yang. Would you mind answering some questions?
Absolutely,
I'm sure there are some.
Absolutely, yes.
Right here, right in this corner.
Yes. Hi, I have a question, and it relates to, I think, recent understanding of very rapid changes in the, particularly in the environment, and I think your projects, how you describe them, I think they're amazing in understanding the kind of comprehensive context that architecture has to exist in, but I'm wondering how you see the limits of architecture to respond to like quick changes in temperature that we all experience, because I think as comprehensive as your projects are, they're based on what we know now about the environment, about what happens to the animals, how much energy we use. But if the weather changes, say 5 degrees over the next 10 years, it might not be that rapid, then say some of your gardens in the buildings might not work, because the plants that are intended to grow there might not grow there anymore. So I'm wondering how you see architecture responding to that kind of change that talks about an integration in a dynamic system in ways that Ian McHarg hasn't predicted, I think.
Well, that's an interesting question. Well, one of the things that became clear to me, that architects are just not very powerful people. We are just designers. We are a service industry. And the things some of my clients say about me, you'd be shocked. So we can only do so much as architects. And the biggest problem is what I call people treating architecture as a placebo. That means a developer comes to you or an industrialist comes to you and say, can you design a headquarter building for me and make it green, and we would do that. Then he goes back to his polluting industry. And so I tell people that actually we should try and persuade industry, persuade business to become green. The other day I was in Portland, Oregon, which is to me one of the greenest cities in the US. And there are architect firms, there are several architects firms in which all its principles are green, are LEED accreditors. And that there are firms in which, for instance, I was told that a firm in Vancouver which is trying to make all its architects become LEED accreditors. So what do all these LEED accreditors do? And I said, what you need to do is not just accredit buildings, but try and persuade your clients, persuade industry, persuade business to make the business green. That's when you become really effective. And so, if you look into the way in which architecture uses energy, it's only about 30% of energy that we use in the country is in buildings, between 30 to 50%. And so we can have some effect on new buildings, we can have some effect on existing buildings, but really it is politics, it is industry, it is business, it's economics that have to be green. And we have to persuade them to become green. And so we as architects can only do so much. My life basically is about not just doing buildings, but about thinking about being green, about doing research, about trying to develop technical systems, trying to experiment, trying to find solutions to some of the problems that I identify for myself. I know that within my lifetime, I wouldn't be able to achieve in the full agenda. But at least I hope that I can establish the groundwork, establish the theory, establish the premises in which other generations could take and develop. And so this is what I hope all of us will do. I'm afraid I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer, but just to simply tell you that we can only do so much as architects, but it is business and industry that must change.
Another question.
I have another question. From America came the idea, the concept of the evidence-based design, and in relation to a hospital, the design of hospitals, the healing environment. Could you say something about the effects, for example, on the well-being of the employees or inmates or patients in this concepts which you showed us?
Well, evidence-based design, I think, was largely promoted by Robert Ulrich from Texas A&M University, and then E.O. Lawrence, I think, developed the concept of biophilia. The plant biophilia is that biophilia is like necrophilia. It's not making love to plants, but it's about how plants can improve our well-being. And studies have shown in evidence-based design that in hospitals, patients that look out into a garden, look out into greenery compared to patients looking into a hard surface, tend to heal faster, tend to have a greater sense of well-being. And so there is evidence that if you have greenery in our buildings, it engenders a much greater sense of well-being and engenders a much more happier environment. But putting plants in buildings also do a number of things. First of all, because plants absorb carbon dioxide, gives us oxygen, and engenders a much more healthier microclimate in that part of the building. It also lowers the ambient temperature. And for instance, again, studies have shown at the Lawrence Berkeley laboratory that if you put greenery on roofs of buildings, it actually lowers the heat island effect for that locality at least by 1 to 2 degrees.
Here you are. Yes, please. Thank you for your very extraordinary lecture. A couple of weeks ago, we had another conference here in the south of the Netherlands called Let's Cradle, from the two persons, one from Germany, one from the United States, William McDonough and Michael Braungart, about the principle cradle to cradle, waste equals food. I think you know your colleague researchers on that field. Have you some comment on the principle of let's cradle?
Well, cradle means, I think the title of his book, Cradle to Cradle, if you like, is an elaboration of the expression cradle to grave. That means, when we look at something, we look at human beings, we look at from the time they were born in the cradle and to the time when they die, which is cradle to grave. So when cradle to cradle, the terminology basically means that we should look at it as a complete cycle, because when things die, it doesn't go somewhere, it doesn't sort of stops there. It goes back into the earth. And so the idea of cradle to cradle is to try and complete the loop in as much as possible. And so Bill McDonough's book is about trying to make everything edible. That means that we can make the food or the waste from one organism becomes the food from another, then we close the loop. And so his whole book is about closing the loop, which is, as I mentioned, one of the properties, but we have to imitate the ecological systems, which is to recycle everything. Now, essentially what we need to do is, the architecture implication is that we have to practice what we call designing for disassembly. That means architecture must be designed so that it enables everything that we make our buildings to be reusable in as much as possible. So that's, for instance, modular coordination, as in Mr. Habraken's work, is extremely important because it enables reusing in as much as possible. So everything that we make with buildings, we can reuse in as much as the building within the building, within the built environment as possible. Then when we cannot reuse it, we recycle it. Obviously, reuse is better than recycle because the amount of energy that you use in reusing is basically transportation and fixing. Whereas recycling, you will have to recycle the entire, reconstitute the material in the first place. And that when you cannot reuse and recycle, we should try and reintegrate back into the natural environment. And so this is one of the things that we have to do as architects and engineers and designers, is to design to close the loop, to enable reusing, recycling, and to reintegrate back in the natural environment. Going back to this gentleman's question, what is natural? It's very simple. Anything that is not human is part of the natural environment. Now, obviously, we can say that, yes, we as human beings are part of the natural environment as well. But in some ways, we're not. We as human beings are unlike any other species in nature. Unlike any other species in nature, because we have immense power. We have immense power to change environment, immense power to change climate, which no other species in the biosphere can do. We have immense power to use resources. So as like Spider-Man says, if you have this power, you have to exercise it with great care. And this is what differentiates us from other species in the natural environment. Yes, human beings are part of the natural environment. Human species is one species, similar as any other species in nature, but a lot of us don't recognize this. We think that we are the superior species. We have more right to be in this earth than anybody else. In the eyes of nature, we're not. We're just one of a number of species. And so I use the word natural environment as a terminology to describe anything that is in nature which is non-human. It's an expression, that's what I call natural environment. So back to this thing on culture. Yes, I think culture is extremely important. It's complex. Whether you look at culture from the architect's point of view, from the archaeological point of view, there are many differences of culture. But culture is something that changes over time. And even within different countries, culture is different. So the other day, for instance, I was asked to design a cultural building. And this was a building in Singapore. And I said, there's no way we're going to design a building with Chinese roofs with tweak ends. And then, the cultural emblem of Singapore is the merlion, which is the lion head with the body of a mermaid. I said, we're not going to design a building that represents, a merlion. So we said, look, there are many ways to address culture in our buildings. To me, there are 5 basic strategies. First is what I call replication. Second is reinterpretation. Third is abstraction. Fourth is neutrality. And fifth is spirit of the place. Replication means, for instance, if you're designing in a very culturally sensitive environment, like, for instance, in the Forbidden City in Beijing, it's a culture, the architecture has been existent for several hundred years. It would be a travesty to put a modern building there. And so if you're designing in a very culturally, historically important location, you should try and replicate. So that's one strategy. The second strategy is what I call reinterpretation. For instance, if you're designing in a tropical climate, what we try to do is look at the cultural buildings that exist historically in that location and try to reinterpret this in a modern sort of way. And third is what I call abstraction. Sometimes there could be an emblem that you can abstract and make it into the form of the building. Fourth is what I call neutrality, in the sense that, like the project that we did in Singapore, we said that, look, we're not going to replicate the Chinese roofs, we're not going to replicate the merlion, but we wanted to create an environment in which cultural activities could take place. So we gave them a plaza, and we started to map cultural activities that take place in Singapore over the entire year, and we said, let these cultural activities take place in this plaza because it's the people who make the culture. And so in this way, people use the building, they have cultural activities there, then it becomes a cultural building. And the last is the spirit of the place. Sometimes the sense of a locality has to do with the spirit, and we don't have to recreate it and replicate in exactly the same way, but we can actually try and reinterpret it in a contemporary sort of way. So for instance, one of the foremost experts on most Islamic architecture is Abdul Halim, an Egyptian architect. And so one day I met him for the first time, and we were in a car together in Kuwait, going towards the airport, and I said, Mr. Halim, you're an expert on Islamic cultural buildings, you're an expert in Islamic architecture. Tell me, what is Islamic architecture? How do I design an Islamic building? And he came up with a very surprising answer. He said, Islamic buildings is not putting domes, it's not having minarets, it's not having Islamic arches. What you need to do is design in such a way that engenders the feeling of the greatness of Islam. I said, oh. I said, that means you can design Islamic building in a modern way. He said, yes. but you must be able to engender this feeling and how to do this. If you're able to successfully create it, whether in a plaza, or whether in a building, or whether in the interior, that's what Islamic architecture is all about. So in answering to cultural, designing with culture, there are different strategies, and you adopt the strategy in a situationalist sort of way. You have to adopt the right strategy for the right location at the right point in time. And so this is how I would address the issue of culture.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question, please.
Oh, thank you. How did you combine things like safety issues and maintenance problems into your designs?
Safe issues. Safe issues. Well, I mean, for instance, I went to a building the other day, well, actually yesterday, I went to a shop house where the parapet is less than 1 meter high. Then I said, well, it's only about 600. Isn't that safe? Then I said, let's check the bylaws. The bylaw shows that the parapet should be 800 millimeters, and I said 800 is still not enough because it's still below the waist. And so, these are some of the things we need to consider. This says the bylaws, and these are the ways of, designing buildings. And obviously, we have to address, meet with bylaws. How to address this issue of safety. And then the question of maintenance. Oh dear, I lost the issue of maintenance. I think green buildings have to be maintained. It costs more to maintain the green buildings than a conventional building. But it's like having a garden at home. If you want to have a garden, you must be prepared to tender it. So then comes the issue of cost. I know I get asked this all the time, so I might as well address this straight away. People ask me, do green buildings cost more? I says, well, yes and no. Studies have shown by the Green Building Council in the US that if you take a building type and you take the construction costs, industry standard for that building type. So for instance, if you're building an office building and the industry standard is, say, $200 per square foot, at industry standard, you should be able to achieve minimal accreditation for LEED. But if you want to have silver rating, you have to increase the budget by at least 10 to 15%. Gold rating about 20% above existing the industry standard budget for that particular building type, and platinum between 25 to 30%. And so when I meet a client for the first time, I'm just trying to tell you how I work as an architect, that I use 3 models with a client. The first is the design model. That means the spatial model, the commercial model, the requirements. So I say, look, these are your first model I have, which is the client's model, the conventional design requirements. The second model is the financial model. I said to the client, what is your budget for the building? How can you achieve what you want me to achieve, the design? What is the level of cost you want me to achieve in this design? And the third is the green model. How green can I get with your spatial requirements and your financial limitations? And so once I have these 3 models in place, the convergence of these 3 models in the apex of the triangle is a design. So in this way, I look at the client's requirements, I look at the cost, and I look at the green requirements, and I say, this is as green as I can get with the budget that you have. So in the same way, I look at maintenance for the client. I says, look, if you want to have this building, you have to maintain it, and we think this is how much it will cost you to maintain it. If you want it to have it, this is what you must pay for. You're a delightful audience. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.